It began in the cold grey dawn of May 24th, 1941, a morning shrouded in mist and tension on the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. The British battleship HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy and symbol of British naval supremacy, steamed through the Denmark Strait alongside the newly commissioned HMS Prince of Wales. Ahead of them, somewhere beyond the fog and the waves, loomed the might of Nazi Germany's most feared warship, the Bismarck. A floating fortress of steel, armed with massive 15-inch guns and protected by near impenetrable armor, the Bismarck was the terror of the Atlantic, a ship built to challenge Britain's command of the seas. On that fateful morning, two fleets met in one of the most dramatic and tragic encounters in naval history. The Hood, firing first, roared with defiance, her guns lighting up the horizon, but within minutes, the Bismarck returned fire with deadly precision. A single catastrophic shell struck the Hood's magazines, and in an instant, Britain's greatest ship vanished in a towering explosion, taking over 1,400 men with her to the bottom of the sea. The shock reverberated through the Royal Navy and across the entire British Empire. The loss of the Hood was not just a military blow, it was a wound to national pride. From that moment forward, one order echoed through every Admiralty office and every ship of the Royal Navy: sink the Bismarck. What followed was one of the most relentless pursuits in maritime history, a desperate chase across the stormy North Atlantic. Dozens of ships, submarines, and aircraft scoured the sea, tracking the Bismarck as it fled toward occupied France. Damaged but defiant, the German battleship fought off attacks from the air and sea, her crew knowing that survival was slipping away with every mile. British Swordfish torpedo bombers braved anti-aircraft fire and towering waves, one torpedo striking the Bismarck's rudder, crippling her steering and sealing her fate. Days later, surrounded by British battleships and cruisers, the hunted giant met her end beneath a storm of shells and fire. As the Bismarck sank beneath the waves, over 2,000 German sailors went with her, a grim finale to one of World War II's most intense naval duels. Tonight we'll tell the full story of the Battle of the Denmark Strait, the clash that set the North Atlantic ablaze, the pride and the tragedy of the Hood, the unstoppable power of the Bismarck, and the epic manhunt that captured the world's attention. This is not just a tale of ships and steel, but of human courage, fear, and determination, the kind of story that defines the brutal poetry of naval warfare. And before we dive in, I want to know, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it as you join me for this voyage into one of World War II's most haunting naval battles? In the cold expanse of the North Atlantic, the sea rolled like molten steel under a sky of endless grey. Each wave carried the scent of salt and fuel, each gust whispering stories of ships that vanished beneath. This was no ordinary ocean. It was the artery of empires, the lifeline that bound Britain to its colonies and allies. Across its vast waters steamed convoys of merchantmen, heavy with grain, oil, and hope. Beneath them lurked shadows of another kind, silent predators stalking in the dark. The U-boats of the Kriegsmarine prowled these depths, listening to the rhythm of propellers like hunters, attuned to the heartbeat of prey. To Berlin, control of this ocean promised starvation for Britain and supremacy for Germany, but to the sailors who ventured into it, the Atlantic was a graveyard waiting to claim the careless and the brave alike. Every convoy that sailed west carried not just cargo, but the fragile thread of survival for a besieged nation. The stage was set for a war fought not on land, but in the cold, merciless heart of the sea. After the humiliation of the First World War, Germany's navy had been shackled by treaty and memory. The once proud high seas fleet had been scuttled at Scapa Flow, its bones left to rust beneath the waves. But the dream of naval power, of challenging the British Empire on its own element, never truly died. In secret shipyards and hidden design bureaus, that dream was reborn in steel and ambition. The Kriegsmarine under Admiral Erich Raeder envisioned a new fleet, sleek, modern, and devastatingly armed. Submarines would strangle Britain's trade, while surface raiders would slice through convoys like wolves among lambs. Yet it was not merely power that drove them, but pride, a defiance of history itself. Germany would no longer kneel before the Royal Navy. It would rise from the depths to haunt it, and in that haunting, the Atlantic would again become the world's most contested battlefield. By 1939, the ocean silence was broken by the sound of warships stirring in their harbors. Diesel engines growled in the grey dawn, and seamen young and old prepared for a fight they could scarcely imagine. The Kriegsmarine was small compared to the Royal Navy, yet its officers carried the arrogance of a nation reborn. They believed in speed, precision, and surprise, qualities that could outmatch numbers and experience. German engineers built vessels that were more than machines. They were statements of national will. The sea trials of these ships drew crowds, their gleaming hulls reflecting a nation's hunger for greatness. But beneath the pride ran a current of fatalism, a sense that history's tides could turn as quickly as the wind. Across the North Sea, British admirals watched these developments with unease, aware that a storm was forming beyond their horizon. The peace that followed the First World War had been a pause, not an ending. And in that uneasy calm, both predator and prey sharpened their blades. For Britain, the Atlantic was not just water, it was oxygen. Every ship that arrived in Liverpool or Glasgow brought the sustenance of empire, food from Canada, fuel from the United States, weapons from factories abroad. Without these lifelines, the island would suffocate. The Royal Navy, stretched across half the globe, bore the impossible burden of protecting every mile of ocean. Convoys became the heartbeat of the war effort, slow-moving targets guarded by destroyers and corvettes that fought fatigue as much as the enemy. In the mess decks, sailors listened to the radio for reports of sinkings, the names of ships that would never return. For them, the enemy was unseen, a whisper in the deep, a shape in the fog. The U-boat war was not fought in glory, but in fear, measured in hours of tension and seconds of terror. Britain's command of the sea was no longer absolute. It was under siege, and the men who fought to preserve it did so against an enemy who thrived in silence. Deep beneath the waves, inside steel coffins that smelled of oil and damp, German submariners prepared for their own kind of war. They were young, confident, and convinced of their mission to strangle Britain until she bled out. Each U-boat was a weapon of patience, its crew living in darkness for weeks, sustained by discipline and obsession. The ocean above was their hunting ground, the convoy routes their veins of prey. They struck at night, surfacing like ghosts, their torpedoes leaving trails of death in the phosphorescent sea. Victories were celebrated in whispers. Losses were met with silence. In the dim red glow of their control rooms, men listened to the creak of metal as pressure closed around them. They fought not just the enemy, but the sea itself, a vast, indifferent killer that showed mercy to no one. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun as a war of attrition, but it would become something darker, a war of endurance. Above the depths, the surface raiders took their turn. The pocket battleships Admiral Graf Spee and Deutschland prowled the southern seas, disrupting trade routes and spreading fear far beyond their firepower. Each success emboldened Hitler's naval command, each sinking proof that the Reich could challenge the British Empire where it once ruled unopposed. Yet these early victories carried a hidden cost. They provoked a sleeping giant. The Royal Navy, vast and unyielding, began to adapt. Convoys grew tighter, escorts more coordinated, intelligence sharper. For every German triumph, there was a tightening of the noose. But in 1941, as the Atlantic stormed and the world waited, Germany prepared a weapon unlike any other. She was vast, armored, and terrifyingly beautiful, a battleship born not just for war, but for legend. Her name was Bismarck, and her voyage would turn the Atlantic into a graveyard of giants. To the sailors who saw her glide from port, Bismarck was more than steel. She was destiny made real. Her guns, each the size of a railway car, could hurl death over 20 miles. Her armor was thicker than any ship afloat, her engines capable of outrunning pursuit. She represented the pinnacle of German engineering and the hubris of a regime convinced of its own invincibility. In the dockyards of Kiel, crowds cheered her as if she were a goddess reborn from the depths. Her crew, hand-picked from across the Reich, carried not just training but faith in their vessel's invulnerability. Yet among them were whispers of overconfidence, of fate's cruel symmetry. They knew that every invincible ship carried within it the seeds of tragedy. The Atlantic, impartial and eternal, would decide her worth, and in its frozen silence both hunter and hunted would find no mercy. As 1941 dawned, the Atlantic stood poised between dominance and despair. The convoys still sailed. Though fewer returned whole, the U-boats prowled deeper, their torpedoes spreading like whispers of doom. Britain clung to survival by its fingernails, its empire trembling under the weight of distance and loss. In Berlin, Hitler's eyes turned once more to the west, to the grey horizon where his navy sought redemption. The sea, ancient and unforgiving, awaited its next sacrifice. For within that boundless expanse of steel and salt, legends were born and broken. The ghosts of the Atlantic stirred once again, their voices rising in the wind that swept across its waves. The stage was set for the clash that would echo through the century, and somewhere beyond the fog, Bismarck waited for her destiny to begin. In the shipyards of Blohm and Voss in Hamburg, under cranes that loomed like iron skeletons, a new Leviathan began to take shape. Sparks rained from the torches of welders as steel plates were fused into a hull destined to command both fear and fascination. The sound of rivets echoed across the docks like gunfire, a symphony of industry and ambition. To the men who worked there, the ship was not merely a construction project, it was the resurrection of a dream long denied. Germany's humiliation after the Great War had left its navy broken, its admirals silenced, its pride drowned at Scapa Flow. But in 1936, under the rearmament program of the Third Reich, that silence was shattered by the clang of steel and the hum of power. The ship that rose from the slipway would be a statement to the world, a declaration that Germany had returned to the seas. Her name, chosen by Hitler himself, carried the weight of empire and vengeance, Bismarck. As her keel touched the water, the crowd that gathered wept and cheered in equal measure. They saw in her reflection not a warship, but the spirit of a nation reborn from defeat. Every line of Bismarck's design spoke of dominance. She was 823 feet of steel and willpower, longer than any cathedral and just as awe-inspiring. Her 8 15-inch guns, mounted in 4 massive turrets, could send shells the weight of a small car across 20 miles of ocean. Beneath her deck lay layers of armor so thick that even the Royal Navy's largest shells would struggle to pierce them. Her engines, turbines of German precision, drove her through the sea at over 30 knots, astonishing speed for her size. Yet power came with complexity. Bismarck was a floating fortress of 50,000 tons that required hundreds of men and flawless coordination to function. Her interior was both luxurious and lethal, corridors lined with polished brass and bulkheads that smelled of oil and iron. For the engineers who built her, every bolt was an act of worship, every weld a stroke of devotion to national perfection. She was not just the product of naval science, but of ideology, crafted to embody the strength and purity the Reich preached to the world. In her hull, Germany's destiny had been cast, one rivet at a time. When she slid down the slipway on February 14, 1939, the world took notice. The launch was a spectacle of orchestration and pride, with banners, music, and the precision of a military parade. Thousands of spectators crowded the docks, their breath frosting in the winter air as champagne shattered across her bow. As she struck the water, a roar erupted, half celebration, half warning. British intelligence officers in distant London took careful note. The birth of Bismarck marked the dawn of a new naval threat. To the Reich, she was a symbol of modern power, faster than the British Hood, more resilient than any French battleship, and built with a singular purpose to crush Britain's naval supremacy. Propaganda films showed her cutting through waves like a blade through silk, her crew smiling beneath swastika flags that flapped defiantly in the North Sea wind. Children learned her name in schoolbooks. Her image appeared on posters, stamps, and newsreels. She was no longer a ship. She was mythology in motion, and like all myths, her destiny would be bound to tragedy. Life aboard Bismarck was a study in discipline and awe. Her 200-man crew lived within a city of steel, self-contained, efficient, and immaculate. Below deck, engines roared like caged beasts, while above, the endless sea reflected off polished brass fittings. The men were chosen for loyalty and excellence. Each movement was practiced, each command executed with clockwork precision. They trained tirelessly, rehearsing maneuvers in the Baltic under the cold scrutiny of their officers. Meals were served to the rhythm of drills, and sleep came only in narrow bunks that rattled with the vibration of turbines. To them the ship was alive, breathing through her boilers, speaking through her guns, dreaming through their obedience. They addressed her not as it, but as she, an entity of power and protection. Letters sent home spoke not of fear, but of pride, of serving aboard the mightiest ship afloat. Yet beneath that pride lay the quiet dread known only to sailors, the knowledge that the sea, indifferent and eternal, could swallow even the greatest of creations. For the Kriegsmarine, Bismarck represented the pinnacle of Hitler's naval vision, a fleet that could challenge the Royal Navy's mastery. Admiral Erich Raeder saw her as the spearhead of a new surface war, one that would cut through the arteries of Allied supply lines. Alongside her sister ship, Tirpitz, she would project power from the fjords of Norway to the far reaches of the Atlantic. But Raeder's dreams clashed with the realities of war. By 1941, the Kriegsmarine remained numerically inferior, its Grand Plan Z ambitions crippled by the demands of the Eastern Front. Bismarck, magnificent as she was, stood almost alone, a solitary titan facing a sea of adversaries. Her construction had consumed millions of Reichsmarks, resources that could have built dozens of U-boats instead. Yet to Hitler, logic was secondary to spectacle. He needed symbols of invincibility, proof that the Third Reich's reach extended beyond land. And in Bismarck he found that symbol, a floating cathedral to German might. When she conducted her sea trials in the Baltic, her performance exceeded every expectation. Her engines sang with mechanical perfection, her gunners trained with ruthless precision, and her hull sliced through waves like a predator reborn. Officers recorded every detail, the way her rudder responded like muscle, the calm vibration of her engines even at full power. She was not simply operational. She was majestic on deck. The wind whipped through the uniforms of her crew, carrying with it the scent of salt and victory. Below, in her fire control rooms and plotting centers, officers practiced the art of naval death with mechanical detachment. They could hit a moving target over 20 kilometers away, adjusting for curvature, wind, and roll with eerie accuracy. The ship's designers had crafted perfection in steel, but perfection, as history would soon remind them, is fragile. In her precision lay her curse. Every flawless mechanism, every shining gun barrel, was another thread in the web of destiny tightening around her name. To the world beyond Germany, Bismarck was a challenge, a direct insult to British maritime dominance. The Admiralty in London studied her with fascination and fear. They knew that her guns could outrange nearly any ship in their fleet, that her armor was thicker than their shells could penetrate. But more than that, they knew what she represented, the revival of a foe long thought buried beneath the wrecks of 1918. In war rooms lit by maps and cigarette smoke, admirals debated how to counter her, how to bring down a monster before it could break their lines. The Hood, Britain's pride and symbol of naval glory, stood ready to answer that challenge. It was more than a coming clash of steel. It was a duel between eras, between empires, between myths. And as Bismarck prepared to sail into the open Atlantic, the Royal Navy steeled itself for what was to come. The ghosts of Jutland stirred once again, whispering through the corridors of history. By the spring of 1941, Bismarck stood ready for war. Her hull gleamed beneath the grey northern sun, her decks echoing with the sound of boots and the bark of orders. Crews manned their posts with precision, unaware that they were stepping into legend. In the command tower, Captain Ernst Lindemann looked out over the cold expanse of the Baltic, his face carved with pride and apprehension. The ship he commanded was flawless, but fate was never so kind to perfection. Around her, the waters rippled as if in anticipation of the storm to come. The great beast of steel would soon leave her harbor, bound for a destiny written not by men, but by the sea. Bismarck was no longer a weapon. She was prophecy made real. And as her anchors lifted and her engines thundered to life, a new chapter in the war began, echoing across the Atlantic like the awakening of a giant. In the grey dawn that stretched over Scapa Flow, the heart of the Royal Navy beat beneath a veil of mist and silence. The sea rolled cold and heavy around the anchored battleships, each one a monument to centuries of empire and endurance. The air reeked of oil and salt, of machinery kept alive through exhaustion and necessity. Sailors moved like ghosts across steel decks, slick with dew, their boots echoing through corridors lined with history. Every ship carried the weight of old victories and the shadow of new defeats. The Admiralty knew the truth. The Empire's arteries flowed through the Atlantic, and if those were severed, Britain would bleed. From the convoys threading through U-boat-infested waters to the distant patrols near Iceland and Norway, every wave carried the possibility of death. The North Sea was not merely a battlefield, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled, and over it all hung an unspoken truth. Britain was fighting not only for survival, but for memory, for the right to still call herself a maritime power. The old empire now watched the horizon with tired eyes, daring the darkness to make its move. The Royal Navy of 1941 was vast in number, yet stretched to breaking point. Destroyers, corvettes, cruisers, and aging dreadnoughts were scattered across oceans that spanned half the globe. Every theatre demanded its own guardians. Singapore, Alexandria, Gibraltar, the Atlantic, each consuming ships faster than they could be replaced. Fuel was rationed, repair docks overflowed, and every sailor knew that a single torpedo could undo years of effort. The Admiralty's maps were covered in red pins, marking convoy routes, and black ones marking losses. Between them ran thin blue lines of hope, the escorts that kept Britain's lifeline breathing. They sailed in cold, relentless seas, often outnumbered and outgunned, guided by radar flickers and gut instinct. Every rescue, every wreck pulled from the waves reminded them of the stakes. For the Royal Navy, this was no longer about glory, it was about endurance. And in endurance, Britain still ruled supreme. Yet, even as they fought the invisible menace beneath the waves, another shadow loomed above, the threat of the German surface fleet. Bismarck, Tirpitz, and the heavy cruisers of the Kriegsmarine haunted the North Atlantic like wolves at the edge of sight. British intelligence knew they were coming. The only question was when and where. Admirals studied the reports under the dim light of map rooms deep beneath London, tracing potential routes with trembling fingers. The thought of a single breakout sent shivers through the command chain. A battleship like Bismarck could shatter convoys, sink escorts, and vanish before retaliation arrived. The Royal Navy's might was still formidable, but its strength lay in many ships, not in the perfection of one. And so the Admiralty waited, poised like a coiled spring, for the day the German Leviathan would rise from the fog. Every eye on the North Sea watched for her silhouette. Every ship's captain knew the call could come at any hour. Scapa Flow, the fortress harbour of Britain's northern defence, was both sanctuary and tomb. It had seen fleets sail to glory and fleets return in ruin. The ghost of the Great War lingered there. German ships scuttled after surrender, their rusting carcasses still visible beneath the waves. The men stationed there felt history pressing on their shoulders like the weight of an anchor. They lived in the echo of the past, surrounded by the bones of empires. The wind that swept across the Orkneys carried the sting of sea spray and the scent of diesel, a reminder that peace was as fragile as the horizon. The great guns of Hood and Prince of Wales pointed northward, as though daring the enemy to breach their waters. The crews cleaned and maintained them with reverence, knowing they might soon be fired in anger once more. To serve at Scapa Flow was to exist in waiting, an endless vigil beneath a cold and restless sky, and in that waiting, the seeds of destiny began to stir. In London, the war at sea was waged not only by sailors, but by men of paper and ink. The Admiralty War Room hummed with the soft chatter of typewriters, telephones, and coded transmissions. Reports from convoys arrived hourly, each one a mixture of tragedy and triumph. Charts tracked enemy submarines like moving scars across the Atlantic. The first Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, rarely slept, his eyes bloodshot from nights spent under flickering lamps. He knew the pressure. Churchill himself demanded results, demanded safety for the ships that fed the nation. Every merchant vessel that reached Liverpool was a victory. Every one that didn't was a silent accusation. The walls of the war room were lined with maps scarred by pins and strings, a geography of desperation. And beneath all the numbers, all the tactics, pulsed a deeper fear that Britain's mastery of the sea might finally be slipping through her fingers. For the men at sea, the struggle was personal. They felt the ocean in their bones, the cold biting through wool and skin alike. They smelled the thick fumes of burning oil and salt. The stench of fear mingled with sweat and smoke. Nights were endless, black voids broken only by the faint glow of phosphorescent waves or the flicker of enemy searchlights on the horizon. When orders came through the radio, enemy sighted, the silence aboard would turn electric. Boots thudded against steel, gun crews ran to stations, and the heartbeat of the ship quickened. They were the sentinels of a dying empire, holding fast in seas that had swallowed thousands before them. Even in terror there was pride, the pride of those who knew that without them, Britain would starve. Each convoy guarded was another day of survival for the island nation behind them. They fought the cold, the sea, and the enemy, but most of all they fought the darkness itself. Among the ships that stood watch, one name carried more reverence than any other: HMS Hood. She was the embodiment of British power, a relic of the Great War, yet still the pride of the fleet. Her crew adored her, spoke of her as a living being rather than a vessel of steel. Her decks were polished to perfection. Her guns gleamed like instruments of divine wrath. To serve aboard Hood was to stand at the heart of naval tradition, a floating cathedral of empire and defiance. But time had dulled her armor, and the new age of warfare had outpaced her design. Admirals knew she was vulnerable, though few dared to admit it aloud. Still, when the order would come to hunt Bismarck, there would be no hesitation. The old lion would rise once more, roaring into the grey seas of destiny. For the men of Hood, glory and doom had always sailed side by side. As spring turned to 1941, the tension in the North Atlantic became palpable, a silence before the storm. Rumors of German movements spread through the fleet like whispers through the fog. Somewhere in the darkness, an enemy giant was preparing to break free. The Admiralty's messages grew sharper, coded urgency layered beneath calm phrasing. At Scapa Flow, boilers were lit, anchors raised, and ships turned their bows toward open water. The Royal Navy, weary yet unbroken, stood ready to defend the lifeline of its nation once more. Above them, the gulls screamed across grey skies, and the wind carried the taste of iron and salt. For centuries Britain had ruled the waves, but now the waves ruled her fate. The coming days would test not only ships and sailors, but the very soul of an empire. And in the vast, restless waters of the North Atlantic, destiny began to stir beneath the surface. In the grey dawn of May 19th, 1941, the fjords of Norway trembled with the low growl of awakening engines. Mist rolled across the still waters as Bismarck's turbines roared to life, their echoes bouncing off the icy cliffs like distant thunder. Sailors moved with precision on her decks, faces lit by the ghostly glow of floodlights, as cables were uncoiled and anchors prepared. The cold air carried the tang of fuel and steel, a metallic promise of violence to come. Nearby, the sleek silhouette of the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen waited like a shadow, her crew watching in silence as the giant beside them stirred. Operation Rheinübung, the bold strike into the Atlantic, had begun. For Admiral Günther Lutyens, this was no act of recklessness but of calculation. A strike at Britain's beating heart. The sea orders from Berlin were clear: break through the North Atlantic, destroy merchant convoys, and bring the empire to its knees through starvation. It was the Kriegsmarine's greatest gamble, a test of its steel against the Royal Navy's tradition. As the ships slipped from their moorings, the fjord swallowed their sound, leaving only ripples on the cold black water. Admiral Lutyens stood on Bismarck's bridge, his expression carved in stone beneath the brim of his cap. A man of restraint and caution, he understood the magnitude of the mission better than anyone. Behind him, the officers whispered of glory, of the chance to rewrite the humiliation of Scapa Flow and the lost high seas fleet of the Great War. But Lutyens knew that pride could sink faster than any torpedo. His orders were not to seek battle with capital ships, but to destroy commerce, to strike where Britain was weakest. The plan, forged in the quiet corridors of the OKM in Berlin, was daring yet desperate. Germany's U-boats had been bleeding the convoys dry, but the Reich needed a statement, a symbol of naval supremacy. Bismarck was that symbol, her name already heavy with myth, before she fired a single gun in anger. Lutyens gave the order to proceed north, his voice steady, unyielding, echoing across the bridge. Beneath him, the ship surged forward into the fog, a predator entering the unknown. Below deck, the rhythm of the ship was alive, a metallic heartbeat pulsing through corridors of riveted steel. Men worked in shifts, stoking boilers and checking gauges, their hands blackened by grease and smoke. The temperature in the engine rooms climbed with every knot gained, the air thick and humming with tension. Above, the decks smelled of salt, cold oil, and the faint sweetness of rain. Sailors took their stations, scanning the empty sea with eyes trained by months of drills. In their mess halls, conversations were hushed, each man aware that they were part of something larger than themselves. Letters from home were tucked into pockets, beside trinkets and photographs that reminded them why they fought. They didn't speak of fear, but it hung in the air nonetheless, unseen like the condensation that gathered on steel bulkheads. Some prayed softly to themselves, others to the rhythm of the engines, and as Bismarck cut through the waves, her wake glowed faintly in the midnight sun, a streak of defiance across the northern sea. The mission's risk was monumental. To break into the Atlantic undetected meant threading through a gauntlet of British patrols, radar nets, and reconnaissance aircraft. The Royal Navy's home fleet watched every movement from the Norwegian coast to Iceland, hungry for signs of a breakout, but the Germans had chosen their moment with precision. Heavy fog blanketed the seas, and Allied intelligence underestimated the scope of Rheinübung. From the cliffs of Bergen, Norwegian civilians watched in uneasy silence as two dark forms disappeared into the grey horizon, their wakes dissolving into mist. Lütjens relied on stealth, discipline, and the unspoken understanding that speed was survival. Bismarck's engines rumbled at 30 knots, her crew drilled to silence even the smallest mechanical noise that might betray her. Beneath the calm, every man knew discovery meant annihilation. They were playing a deadly game of cat and mouse, and for now the cat was still asleep. Berlin watched with pride as news of Bismarck's departure reached the Führer's headquarters. To Hitler, this mission was a symbol of destiny fulfilled, the resurrection of German naval power, long denied by the Treaty of Versailles. Propaganda reels already spoke of the invincible sword of the Reich, the might of a ship that could outrun and outgun anything Britain could muster. But behind the triumphal rhetoric lay uncertainty. The Luftwaffe could not cover the Atlantic. Supply ships would have to meet the raiders in open ocean. Even the Kriegsmarine's admirals questioned the wisdom of sending their greatest warship without a full battle group. Lütjens knew it too, though his face betrayed nothing. He trusted in discipline, not delusion, and his crew in turn trusted in him. The sea, he often said, had no loyalty, only those strong enough to command it, and as Bismarck pressed into the Denmark Strait, that lesson was about to be tested beyond measure. By the third day at sea, the weather had turned wild. Waves the size of cathedrals crashed over the bow, sending geysers of salt water into the air. Men clung to railings as the ship rolled beneath the weight of the storm, their faces lashed raw by freezing spray. Inside, instruments rattled and dishes crashed, but the engines never faltered. The North Atlantic was no place for the faint-hearted. It was a realm of ice and darkness, where even gods could drown. Lütjens remained on the bridge, peering through binoculars that caught only mist and shadow. Somewhere beyond the veil, British destroyers prowled, their sonar pinging through the void. Every hour stretched into eternity, every bearing checked and rechecked. Then for a moment the clouds parted, and there lay open sea, glittering cold beneath the pale northern sun. The storm had hidden them, and now it might also set them free. To the crew, the voyage became both triumph and torment. They felt the power of Bismarck beneath their feet, the surge of her engines, the deep vibration that made even the air hum. Yet the endless horizon reminded them how small they truly were. Some spoke of superstition, of omens whispered in the creak of bulkheads, or the groan of steel under pressure. The ship felt alive, and in that life there was both awe and fear. Even the officers, hardened veterans of the North Sea, sensed something fateful in the air. They drilled relentlessly, damage control, gunnery, radar checks, turning repetition into ritual. The mission had no margin for error. One mistake, one spark of complacency, and the sea would claim them all. Still, when they gathered in the mess at night, laughter returned in brief bursts, stories of home shared between cups of bitter coffee, and in those small human moments, courage found its quiet form. As Bismarck and Prinz Eugen neared the Denmark Strait, the fog thickened again, swallowing the horizon whole. The ocean was vast and silent, but beneath its calm the world was holding its breath. Eugen stood over the map table, his hand tracing the thin line that led toward open Atlantic waters and the convoys beyond. Every mile ahead carried danger, every decision consequence. Somewhere to the west, the British home fleet was moving too, guided by fragments of intelligence and instinct. The two sides were now on a collision course written by fate itself. The sea between Greenland and Iceland would soon become a stage for fire and legend. As the sun vanished behind the storm clouds, Bismarck plunged into the fog, an iron cathedral carrying 2,200 souls toward immortality. And in that endless grey expanse, destiny began its final approach. At dawn on May 19th, 1941, the grey mists over Gotenhafen clung low to the water, heavy and cold with the scent of salt and steel. Dockworkers moved in silence beneath the towering shadow of Bismarck, their breath visible in the chill Baltic air. The harbour, usually alive with shouts and clamour, was eerily subdued, its rhythm replaced by the distant thrum of turbines waking from slumber. Seagulls wheeled above, their cries drowned by the hum of generators and the scrape of boots on metal decks. Orders echoed faintly across the quay, carried by voices muffled under the weight of secrecy. The crew of Bismarck lined her decks in silence, faces pale beneath their caps as they looked toward the grey horizon. Many had written letters home the night before, folded neatly and handed off to couriers who vanished into the fog. For some, those envelopes would be the last words their families would ever read. The Baltic was calm, but the air carried tension, a stillness before the storm. As the first mooring line slipped free, the great battleship stirred like a leviathan awakening from the depths. Below decks, the ship hummed with controlled chaos. Boilers rumbled, gauges flickered, and men hurried through narrow steel corridors, their movements synchronized like parts of a living organism. The temperature climbed in the engine rooms, the scent of oil and metal thick enough to taste. Somewhere deep within the hull, the turbines began to turn, filling the air with a low, vibrating growl that could be felt through every boot sole. Mechanics shouted over the roar, checking pressure valves and inspecting fuel lines as sweat formed on their brows despite the northern chill. Up above, deckhands secured cables and ran final inspections on the anti-aircraft guns, glistening with dew. Officers barked clipped commands, voices sharp against the hum of machinery. The ship's bell struck, its tone clear and cold, marking the hour of departure. For the crew, it was more than a sound. It was a summons, a reminder of the destiny that awaited them beyond the Baltic. And as Bismarck began to glide from her berth, every man aboard felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. On the bridge, Admiral Günther Lütjen stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the distant mouth of the harbour. The brim of his cap cast a shadow over his face, concealing thoughts that none dared disturb. He was a man burdened not with fear but with clarity, aware that this mission, more than any before it, could define or destroy the Kriegsmarine's legacy. Captain Ernst Lindemann stood beside him, his gloved hands resting lightly on the chart table, the faint tremor of excitement betraying his composure. Between them a silence hung heavier than words. The sea stretched ahead, a grey expanse that shimmered under the faint light of dawn, vast and unknowable. "Engines ahead, 1/3, Lindemann ordered quietly, his voice steady yet firm. The ship responded like a beast obeying its master, cutting through the water with silent grace. Behind them the harbour faded into mist, its watchtowers and cranes shrinking into ghosts. Without ceremony, without fanfare, the most powerful battleship in Europe slipped out to sea. Back on the docks, a handful of officers and harbour guards watched her departure with quiet awe. The sound of the engines rolled across the bay, deep and resonant, as though the ocean itself was answering the call. The crew's families had not been allowed to see them off. Secrecy was absolute. Only a few handwritten farewells remained, crumpled papers tucked into coat pockets or hidden under pillows in Gotenhafen's barracks. To the people of the port, Bismarck was more than a ship. She was a promise, a symbol of national pride reborn from the ashes of the First World War. Her silhouette cut through the morning fog like a monument in motion, her hull gleaming faintly beneath the sheen of sea spray. A lone signal lamp flashed a final message across the harbour, a coded farewell known only to her crew. The message was brief, almost poetic, for the Reich, for honour, for the sea. As she vanished beyond the breakwater, the waters stilled once more, and Gotenhafen returned to its quiet watch. But those who stood there that morning would never forget the sight. They had watched destiny depart. As Bismarck entered open water, the wind shifted, colder and sharper, cutting across the deck like a blade. The Baltic stretched endlessly, a mirror of grey skies reflecting the clouds above. Men manned their stations, scanning the horizon for periscopes or shadows, phantoms that haunted every German sailor since the first U-boat had vanished beneath these same waters. The Kriegsmarine's command demanded silence. Radio transmissions were to be minimal, coded, and brief. Secrecy was their armor. Yet far away in the radio rooms of Britain's Admiralty, analysts already began to stir. Enigma intercepts and reconnaissance whispers had begun to paint an incomplete but alarming picture. Somewhere in the north, a German capital ship was on the move. The chessboard of the Atlantic had begun to shift, and though the men aboard Bismarck did not yet know it, the hunters had already started their pursuit. Life aboard settled into rhythm, orderly, precise, and tense. Officers took turns pacing the bridge, their boots clicking against polished steel. Down below, sailors cleaned weapons, coiled ropes, and performed endless drills to keep fear from seeping in. The sea was deceptively calm, the horizon soft with mist, but unease lingered beneath the discipline. Each man was aware that beyond the Baltic awaited the Royal Navy, vast and merciless. In the mess, men spoke in low voices of Hood and Repulse, of ships whose names carried weight like gods of the sea. Coffee cups rattled with the vibration of the engines, and laughter came rarely, forced through clenched teeth. Still the camaraderie of sailors endured, songs whispered beneath the hum of machinery, jokes told in shadows, and letters read again and again by lantern light. The world outside might have been at war, but for the men inside Bismarck, time had narrowed to the rhythm of the ship. And that rhythm, steady and unrelenting, was the sound of fate drawing near. By late evening, the sky turned copper beneath the dying sun, painting Bismarck in hues of fire and blood. The wind carried a chill from the north, mingling with the faint scent of fuel and salt. The ship moved like a ghost through the gathering fog, her wake a silver scar across the still sea. On deck, lookouts strained their eyes through binoculars, scanning the vast emptiness for movement. In the radio room, Morse signals flickered like nervous heartbeats, encrypted bursts of life between ships, fleeting and fragile. Prinz Eugen followed close behind, her silhouette just visible in the haze, a loyal shadow in the dying light. On the horizon, lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the clouds like the silent flare of distant artillery. Lütjen studied it without expression, his gloved hands resting on the rail. Storms ahead, a young officer murmured, uncertain. Yes, the admiral replied quietly, eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, and not just in the weather. Night fell heavy and absolute, wrapping the Baltic in a shroud of darkness. The stars above were sharp and cold, mirrored faintly in the black surface below. The crew settled into the rhythm of night watch, the only sounds the whisper of waves against the hull, and the steady pulse of the engines below. Somewhere out there, the enemy waited, silent, unseen, but inevitable. The sea offered no comfort, only the vast indifference of nature. Yet within that silence, a strange calm took hold among the men. They were no longer thinking of home, nor of what lay behind. Their world had shrunk to this ship, this crew, this mission. Bismarck was now more than steel and machinery. She was their world, their fortress, and their fate. And as she sailed into the night, unseen beneath the cold northern stars, the course of history turned quietly toward the roar of guns yet to come. In London, the night air hung heavy with tension as wireless operators bent over glowing dials, their headphones whispering the coded heartbeat of war. Deep in the underground rooms of the Admiralty, the Enigma intercepts had begun to form a picture, fragmented, uncertain, but unmistakably alarming. Somewhere in the Baltic, a German capital ship was moving. The officers of naval intelligence gathered around maps, strewn with pins and penciled lines, the hum of machines mingling with the faint tick of a clock, marking another hour closer to dawn. A message from Bletchley Park arrived on thin paper, damp with haste. Rheinübung confirmed. Bismarck has sailed. In that moment, the Atlantic convulsed into motion. Churchill's orders came swiftly, clear, uncompromising, and laced with fury. Sink the Bismarck, he demanded. No matter what it takes, the hunt for the pride of Germany had begun, and the weight of an empire shifted toward the northern seas. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, received the order at Scapa Flow, where grey waves lashed against the hulking silhouettes of anchored battleships. His face, pale beneath the brim of his cap, betrayed no emotion, but his voice was steel. The Royal Navy had waited for this moment, a chance to strike at the heart of the Kriegsmarine's ambitions. Across the cold waters of the Orkneys, signal flags rose, and klaxons blared through the damp morning air. Crews scrambled from hammocks and mess halls, boots clattering on steel decks slick with dew. Engines roared to life, their thunder echoing between the cliffs. Smoke curled skyward from funnels as mighty ships stirred. The King George V, Hood, Prince of Wales, and a dozen cruisers and destroyers. In every cabin, men read the same words posted to bulkheads: enemy battleship at large, immediate interception ordered. The British fleet, weary yet unbroken, was awakening once more, and the sound of that awakening rolled like thunder across the North Sea. In the map rooms beneath the Admiralty, young officers traced possible routes with trembling fingers. The North Atlantic was vast and merciless, its surface concealing 1,000 potential paths for the German raiders. Could Bismarck be heading for the Denmark Strait, or cutting south toward the mid-Atlantic convoys? The uncertainty gnawed at every calculation. Air reconnaissance was limited, weather unpredictable, and the Kriegsmarine was known for silence. But every scrap of intelligence mattered, each intercepted transmission, each Norwegian fishing report, each glimpse from patrol aircraft flying through rain and fog. Code breakers worked without rest, their typewriters clicking like a chorus of metallic insects in the dim light. One message, decrypted just after midnight, confirmed what many feared: Prinz Eugen was sailing with her. The hunters now knew their quarry, and that the prey was not alone. Across the Admiralty floor, the tension thickened like smoke, and somewhere Churchill lit another cigarette. In the corridors of power, the decision was made: Hood and Prince of Wales would intercept. The news spread through the fleet like a current of electricity, part dread, part exhilaration. The Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, was no ordinary ship. She was a legend in steel, a relic of empire still commanding reverence from all who served aboard her. Her decks gleamed with the care of decades, her crew seasoned and loyal, bound by tradition as much as duty. But she was aging, her armor thin compared to the modern monsters of war she would soon face. Captain Ralph Kerr paced her bridge that night, studying the weather and the latest bearings. He knew the risks, and he did not flinch. "We will find her," he said simply, his voice calm against the rumble of the engines. "And when we do, the Hood will not turn away." At sea, the mobilization was more than movement. It was choreography on an oceanic scale. Destroyers fanned out like hounds before a hunt, their wakes slicing white trails across the slate-colored water. Cruisers shifted in formation, radio signals crackling through the air like sparks. The great battleships rolled and groaned against the waves, their decks slick with spray, gun barrels turning slowly toward the gray horizon. Aircraft from Coastal Command scoured the skies, engines roaring over endless miles of empty sea. In the mess decks, sailors studied maps pinned to bulkheads, tracing imagined routes of pursuit with calloused fingers. Coffee was poured thick and black, cigarettes burned fast and nervous. Somewhere, a gramophone played faintly, its melody swallowed by the drone of the engines. The fleet was in motion, ancient, disciplined, relentless, and with every passing hour, the noose around Bismarck began to tighten. Far above the waves, reconnaissance aircraft skimmed through rain-laden clouds, their pilots straining to peer through the shifting veils of mist and fog. The northern seas were treacherous, where weather could change in minutes and turn the sky to ash. One moment, visibility stretched for miles. The next, the horizon vanished entirely. In that grey void, danger was both everywhere and nowhere. But persistence paid its price in frost and fatigue, as British aircrews searched hour after hour, their eyes burning against the glare of low sunlight and reflection off the waves. Finally, a report crackled across the wireless. A shadow, a wake, 2 ships moving north of Iceland. The room fell silent as the message was read aloud. Coordinates followed. Every officer knew what it meant. The chase was no longer theoretical. The hunters had found their scent. Churchill's war room erupted in urgent motion. Phones rang, orders flew, and on the great map that dominated the wall, pins shifted like soldiers in formation. Red lines snaked outward from Scapa Flow, converging on the icy waters near Greenland. "We have them," one officer whispered, almost reverently. Yet even as confidence swelled, the Prime Minister's expression remained grim. He knew the price of naval war, its sudden reversals, its cruel arithmetic. Across the Atlantic, the convoys still sailed, heavy with the lifeblood of Britain's survival. To protect them, Bismarck had to be destroyed, no matter the cost. The Royal Navy was not just fighting for vengeance or pride, it was fighting for the Empire's heartbeat. and in the flickering light of the war room, Churchill leaned forward, his voice low and certain. "Gentlemen, this is no ordinary ship we hunt. This is the ghost of Germany's past returned to sea." By the end of that day, the sea lanes of the North Atlantic had transformed into a vast, living battlefield. Fleets surged from multiple directions, converging upon the cold expanse between Iceland and Greenland. The wind rose, carrying with it the taste of salt and rain, and the ocean itself seemed to brace for what was coming. On the bridges of British warships, captains stared through binoculars at horizons veiled in storm and anticipation. Below decks, sailors tightened straps, checked weapons, and whispered prayers into the mechanical hum of engines. The hunt had begun, but the outcome remained uncertain. Somewhere out there, unseen in the Arctic mists, the Bismarck sailed with purpose and pride. Her guns were silent, her crew calm, her fate unwritten, and as the Royal Navy thundered north to meet her, the world held its breath, waiting for the clash that would echo through the history of the sea. The morning air over the Denmark Strait sat metallic and thin, a cold that bit through wool and steel and left a clean sting on the skin. Cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk rode low in the water, their bows parting a glassy sea that reflected a sky like pewter. Radar screens glowed in dim compartments, tiny green blips sliding across phosphor like watchful eyes. The new technology hummed with a promise no sailor could entirely trust. On Suffolk's bridge, Captain William Whitworth watched the scopes as if they were omens, his jaw set and his breath visible with each careful word. The two British cruisers had orders not to engage, but to shadow, to be the slow, relentless teeth at the edge of a trap. Out on the open decks, lookouts peered through binoculars, their lenses fogging from the cold and from breath that trembled with expectation. Ice formed on cables and railings in filigreed patterns, fragile art born of Arctic weather and long nights. Below, engine rooms pulsed with heat and noise, a heartbeat that kept the ship alive while silence hunted outside. Contact at last. Shadowing begins. Across that same strip of sea, Bismarck and Prinz Eugen moved with the deliberateness of great predators, their wakes white scars on black water. The German captains believed themselves cautious and inscrutable, masters of a plan built on speed and stealth. Yet the ocean is porous to sound and light. Nothing remained hidden forever. The British radars, crude by later standards, nevertheless picked up telltale echoes, two large returns moving steadily westward. Officers compared bearings, whispered, recalculated. They angled to match course and distance, always maintaining the thin margin between being seen and remaining unseen. The men on deck tasted salt and fear, the two mingling until they were indistinguishable. Messages crackled between ships in terse bursts, coded language that stitched a net across the water. The chase had a rhythm now: shadow, adjust, shadow. The chessboard of ocean stretched between them. On Suffolk, the radio operator's fingers moved faster than his face, sending bearings and receiving replies from Admiralty and from Norfolk in rapid, clipped Morse. Each transmission was a small explosion of consequence. A single missent coordinate might mean being discovered too soon. The officers in the plotting room bent over charts, pencils making fine, urgent marks on maps that smelled faintly of paper and whale oil. A cold mist crept in under hatches and turned the breath of men into a fog of its own, each exhale a little cloud of determination. Contact reports were passed up the chain, and in scarper flow the needles on a large table map began to twitch as ships were ordered to weigh anchor. Intelligence stitched to action. The British cruisers maintained a respectful distance, aware that a single miscalculation could bring the heavy guns of Bismarck into deadly range. Still they pushed onward, the staccato of their engines a quiet drumbeat of resolve. The eternal sea stretched between them. The hunt continued. Visibility worsened mid-afternoon, as a bank of mist rolled in from the north, like a slow-moving wall, swallowing horizons and swallowing sound. The world narrowed. Men felt it like pressure in their ears, as though the ocean itself had leaned toward them. On Norfolk, lookouts whispered of a shape in the vapor, a shadow that might be awake, or might be a trick of the light. Orders came down smooth and steady: hold bearing, signal sparingly, do not engage. Electronic eyes took over where human ones failed, and the radar needles pulsed like heartbeats on every chart table. In the wardrooms, officers sipped tepid tea and kept their faces blank, hiding the tremor of excitement or dread that tried to surface. The shadowing became a study in patience, a test of wills played out under a roof of cloud and the slow silver of Arctic seas. Time itself felt weaponized. Each minute stretched the tension. Each hour reshaped hope into something harder. The fog thickened, the game tightened. Meanwhile, in the cramped radio chamber aboard Bismarck, the air smelled of gun oil and the faint metallic tang of nerves. Messages were restrained to a minimum by strict orders. Admiral Lütjens insisted on silence and discipline above all, understanding that prideful noise could doom the mission. Yet men spoke in undertones and passed furtive glances across bulkheads, for nowhere is isolation absolute aboard a great ship. On the German bridge, officers scanned the blank horizon and argued quietly over weather models and predicted Allied movements, each opinion a potential pivot of fate. The sea's mood changed by the hour, and with it the calculation of risk and reward. Somewhere out there, the British cruisers kept time with radar pulses. Somewhere beneath the waves, German destroyers trailed like shadows of shadows. Each side adjusted tactically personally in the half-light of Arctic day. Fate, too, adjusted. Fate watched and waited. Night approached without fanfare, settling like a curtain that made every light valuable and every silhouette perilous. On Suffolk, the radar operator's green blip became everything: the map to follow, the voice to trust. The crew moved through cold corridors, muffled by heavy coats and heavier thoughts. The ship a small warm island in a vast indifferent sea. They fired no guns that night. Instead they fired questions across radio channels and read replies like tea leaves. In the murk, the two forces circled each other with the canniness of chess masters who know the cost of a single lost pawn. Each captain weighed the risk of closing to gun range against the possibility of allowing Bismarck to slip the net and reach the convoys. It was a calculus of hunger and temper. One misstep could renounce victory or doom a fleet. The Greenland ice fields gleamed like distant coffins. The stakes were absolute. At dawn, a report came through. Bismarck's position and course confirmed to a degree that allowed the Admiralty to act. Reinforcements were ordered, and the net began to constrict. Signals flew to Hood and to the heavy units steaming west from Scapa Flow. Destroyer squadrons altered course, and aircraft were tasked to sweep ahead of the interception line. The momentum shifted palpably. What had been a quiet technical exercise now assumed the scale of destiny. On the German deck, men sensed it too, not through instruments, but through the collective mood that rippled like sound through steel. Hands that once moved with the ease of daily routine tightened on railings. Conversations fell away into silence. The sea, which had hidden them hours before, now seemed to point them out with a cold, accusing finger. Decisions loomed. The next move would be decisive. The Denmark Strait, That narrow knife between Greenland and Iceland had become a throat through which both hunter and hunted would pass. The shadows lengthened, and the world narrowed to the arc of a radar needle and the angle of a bearing. In these mist-shrouded hours, the craft of navies, technology, training, tenacity, wrestled with the immutable forces of weather and geography, and each human heart aboard every ship felt the tilt of history in its beat. Men who had never met might soon be bound forever by the thunder they would share. Victors would remember, and those who fell would become a part of the sea's own memory. The British cruisers held their shadowing course with a cold patience born of necessity, and the great German ship, proud and terrible, steamed on toward open ocean and toward confrontation. In the hush before collision, every small motion mattered, a turn, a signal, a whisper. The game, played at once across radar tubes and on salt-bitten decks, was nearly done. The mist watched, and the sea listened. Destiny began to take aim. The evening sky over the Denmark Strait wore the thin blue of Arctic twilight, a color that seemed to set steel alight as silhouettes of capital ships pushed through the cold. Admiral Lancelot Holland's flag fluttered above Hood, a broad banner over a vessel that for a generation had been a metaphor for British sea power. Around her steamed Prince of Wales, fresh from trials and still learning the temper of the ocean and her crew. The newness of her plates did not blunt the determination in the men who manned her guns. Men moved on deck with the purposeful hush of those who know they occupy a place in history, boots striking wet steel in a rhythm older than nations. The smell of oil, brine, and cigar smoke wove through the superstructure, and the ship's engines thumped a slow, confident heartbeat beneath the talking and the charts. Officers checked ranges and elevations with the muted urgency of ritual. The gunnery crews ran drills that smoothed hands and steadied nerves. For many aboard Hood, the ship's name carried family echoes and childhood stories. She was a temple, a memory, a promise that Britain endured. Sailors who had watched her at anchor in peacetime ports now felt the weight of that promise pressing on their shoulders like a uniform that would never fully fit. Above all, Admiral Holland held a calm that was both command and a kind of private dread. He knew that the meeting ahead might settle more than a single sortie. It might answer whether the age of the battlecruiser was truly over. HMS Hood was enormous, not merely in size but in meaning. She had been the focal point of fleet reviews, the subject of postcards, a line in poems read at school. Her decks curved like the back of a great animal, and her turrets rose in formidable pairs, each mount a promise of thunder. Children had traced her outline in sand on English beaches. Sailors ran fingers along railings worn smooth by generations, and in that touch there was an invocation, the call of duty summoned forward through metal. The ship creaked and settled as waves rolled beneath, the sound a slow anecdote to the roar expected to come. Her crew were a cross-section of the nation, seasoned petty officers with eyes like flint, young ratings freshly pressed into service, mechanics whose hands bore the colossus of endless maintenance. Conversations in the mess swung from bravado to soft recollection. The men spoke of mates lost in previous campaigns and of letters tucked away in kit bags. Discipline sat alongside affection for the ship. Affection softened orders into a kind of sacred duty. They polished brass not for ceremony but for luck, believing small rituals could bend fortune. In the quiet moments before action, the Hood felt less like worship and more like a community pressed into iron. Prince of Wales bore a different sort of aura, newer, sharper, and shadowed by her status as a modern answer to a changing naval age. Her steel had been rolled and fitted in yards humming with industrial pride, and she carried systems intended to meet newer threats. Radar, fire control, and armor, designed with lessons of recent battles in mind. Her crew was as proud as any veterans, They had trained in cold weather and long days, learning to read instruments that could mean survival or death. Many were young men who had never known peacetime routine, whose apprenticeship had been in the hot, concentrated school of wartime vigilance. They ate quickly, spoke plainly, and ran the gunnery drills with a mechanical precision that made captains smile. On deck, the ship flexed and answered orders like an athlete responding to a trainer's call. Officers exchanged forecasts and possible maneuvers, fitting each decision into the mosaic of intelligence received through crackling wireless. The two ships, Old Legend and New Steel, moved together as if to show the world a stubborn continuity, that Britain would contest the sea regardless of age or fashion. Side by side, they cut a line through the dusk, a pair of knives drawn for the same cause. The nameless tension between tradition and innovation hummed beneath their wake, like a note struck on an enormous string. Admiral Holland moved across Hood's decks with the careful gait of a man whose face had already been measured by history. His decisions that night would become the subject of scrutiny and argument for years to come. He consulted charts beneath the stark light of lamps that cast long shadows, his finger tracking courses and possible intercepts with methodical steadiness. Around him, signals blazed in flags and lights, and messengers ran like river currents between bridge and plotting room. The cold bit through uniforms. Breaths fogged the air in white plumes that vanished against the vastness of the ocean. Yet there was a focused warmth to the command structure, a concentration of purpose that made the ship feel smaller and the mission larger. Holland's voice held both weight and a strain he refused to let linger in public. He moved between officers and men with the practiced courtesy of a leader who understood that morale is tended with gestures as much as orders. When he paused to speak with a young sailor, the man's eyes shone like wet coal. Such moments kept fear from becoming panic. As tension tightened into purpose, the admiral's calm became a lodestar for the men around him. Below decks, the gunners prepared as if tending to a ritual older than war. They checked breech mechanisms, polished shell hoists, and recited procedural cadences that would carry into battle. The ammunition crews moved with choreographed care, aware that one misstep could ignite catastrophe within the ship herself. Each shell was a small death, wrapped in metal and purpose, a calculation of force and trajectory that separated killing from chaos. Young stokers labored in the bowels to keep steam pressure where it needed to be, their faces flushed with heat despite the Arctic cold. Mechanics tuned turrets and adjusted sights. Every rivet and gear was a little bulwark against fate. In the wardroom, officers exchanged cigarettes and dry jokes to anchor nerves, while religious texts and small trinkets in bunks offered private comfort. The ship lived its life in two realms, the loud, visible one of superstructure and signal, and the intimate mechanical symphony below that kept the guns ready. Both realms were essential, both realms were vulnerable, and both would be tested within hours. Word of Bismarck's proximity moved like ink through a lamp, quick, spreading, impossible to fully contain. In Scapa Flow, signals redirected convoys and summoned reinforcements in the crowded passageways of the fleet. Sailors paused to listen, to imagine the thunder to come. There was a public and private stoicism among the British people. Church bells would toll should victory come. But for now, phones and telegrams carried messages of anxious hope. On Hood's bridge, the Admiral weighed reports of German formations against the need to protect merchant lanes and the larger strategy of the home fleet. Every choice risked exposure or missed opportunity. The symbolic value of Hood could not be separated from tactical reality. To lose her would be to wound a nation's morale in a way that reached far beyond steel. Men in pubs and factories who watched newsreels of the ship hoped she would return triumphant. They believed in the story she represented. That belief filtered into the crews, into the drills, into the quiet prayers murmured under helmets. For sailors who would soon see the enemy's silhouette, that national faith was a force almost as tangible as armor. The sea would judge such faith on its own terms. As the battle group adjusted course into the night, the ocean seemed to lean toward a single expected moment. Stars were blotted out by cloud, and a thin rain began to lace the decks with salt and cold. Lookouts strained beyond the ring of lights, scanning for the flares and plumes that would announce the presence of the enemy. Radios carried brief, clipped reports from reconnaissance aircraft and from the shadowing cruisers. The information was patchy, urgent, and sometimes contradictory. Yet in that patchwork, the outline of contact emerged, like a sketch coming into view under a slow hand. Officers conferred over ranges and speed, mapping courses that might bring Gibraltar's pride and the Kriegsmarine's might into the same frame. Men tightened straps and checked bearings with fingers that felt both steady and too small for the task. The Hood's funnel smoke cut a thin line into the dark, and she bore on toward a future that would be made or broken in moments. The sea gave no counsel, only a cold bearing and a weight that settled in every heart. Fate navigated with iron and will. When dawn bled pale through the clouds, it revealed two great forms on the horizon. One a long-awaited sight for Britain, the other the terrible prow of an opposing will. The crews readied themselves not as anonymous figures, but as witnesses to a turning point. Every man felt the historicity pressing in like the chill of the morning. Hood's silhouette loomed vast and almost human against the sea, her lines incised in light and shadow. For the men aboard she was not simply a ship, but the embodiment of a nation's refusal to be moved. Prince of Wales rode near, youthful and alert, her crew's faces set in grim determination that belied the tremor of fear beneath. On bridges and in gun tubs the last checks were made, the last goodbyes murmured, the last steadying jokes shared so no single man would bear silence alone. They carried with them the certainty that what came next might be remembered in classrooms and in quiet corners of the country for decades. The symbolic weight of Hood was now a physical presence between two battle lines, and as the captains muttered final orders, the ships lurched forward into a contest that would echo far beyond the frozen twilight. In that forward motion there was no turning back, only the sea and the judgment it would deliver. The fog rolled low over the Denmark Strait like a living curtain, swallowing the horizon and muffling the thrum of engines beneath the waves. Steel hulls cut quietly through the mist, their wakes dissolving into a grey stillness that felt older than war itself. Every sound was amplified, the creak of metal, the whisper of signalmen, the steady click of instruments marking distance and bearing. On the British ships, lights were dimmed to pinpricks, glowing faintly in the shroud of night like embers waiting for wind. Men spoke in low tones, their words thick with breath and anticipation, each syllable carried by the cold air like smoke. The ocean exhaled around them, a massive indifferent force, while the sky above promised neither dawn nor mercy. Somewhere out there, they knew, the Bismarck moved, unseen, immense, a rumor given form by intelligence and fear. On both sides of the sea, commanders bent over charts that glistened under red lamps, tracing courses fated to intersect. The night stretched taut between hunter and hunted, and in that silence the line between the two was impossible to tell. Aboard the Hood, the air inside the bridge was sharp with coffee and tension, every officer leaning forward as if the act itself could shorten the distance to contact. Admiral Holland's face was pale and steady, lit by the intermittent flicker of signal lamps from Prince of Wales. The instruments hummed their metallic lullaby, compasses quivered, radar screens blinked, and rangefinders ticked like patient hearts. Below in the gun decks, men sat beside shells the size of small cars, waiting for the order that would unchain them. Some smoked, Others traced family names carved into ammunition crates. The machinery of empire waited for one word: fire. Above, the masts moaned under the strain of Arctic wind, and the waves slapped the hull with dull, rhythmic finality. The world outside was invisible, only sensed in vibrations and shifting shadows. "We'll have her before morning," a young officer murmured, his voice carrying both pride and doubt. The admiral didn't answer. His silence was the only reply necessary. On the Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens walked the length of his flag bridge with the heavy tread of a man bound to inevitability. The great ship's bulk moved with the confidence of engineering genius, smooth, measured, unstoppable. Below him, hundreds of men worked in synchronization, their actions a testament to discipline and fear interwoven into habit. The air was warm with machine heat, the smell of oil clinging to everything like a second skin. The crew felt the presence of their ship as something sacred. Her engines were heartbeats, her guns the voice of destiny itself. Yet even aboard this floating fortress, unease lingered. The British were near, their location a shifting phantom on the radar screen. Lütjens paused by the navigator's table, staring at the delicate arcs drawn in pencil, marks of conquest perhaps, or of doom. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like an unseen hand. "We proceed," he said softly, the words swallowed by the hum of turbines, and the Bismarck obeyed. Between the two forces, the sea was a graveyard of echoes. Every bearing, every signal pulse came back distorted by fog and cold. The Suffolk and Norfolk, shadowing in the mist, sent bursts of contact reports through the static, their operators straining to make sense of half-heard transmissions. Somewhere amid that chaos, clarity flickered, a faint radar blip, then another, moving fast, precise, deliberate. "It's them," whispered a radio man, and the words rippled through the ship like an electric current. Every man knew what that meant. The hunt was ending. Deckhands adjusted gear in silence. Even the sea seemed to hush. The British ships adjusted course, their screws biting deeper into the black water. Dawn was still hours away, but the coming battle had already begun, invisibly, inexorably. The weather grew worse. Sheets of rain hissed against the decks, freezing into sharp glass that clung to the rigging and rails. Men cursed under their breath as wind tore at their coats, and yet beneath the hardship, a grim satisfaction grew. Storm or not, they were closing in. On Prince of Wales, the radar antennae cut through sleet and darkness, tracing unseen arcs of knowledge through the storm. Each operator listened for the faint, irregular beeps that could spell either salvation or annihilation. The officers above trusted that technology, fragile as it was, to guide them where eyesight failed. Below, stokers shoveled coal and watched gauges tremble, aware that heat was as vital a weapon as the guns above. The storm became their ally, a cloak that would hide approach and ambition alike. And in the roaring night, both sides prayed their enemies saw less than they did. In the cramped mess halls of both fleets, men found strange quiet before the storm of war. British sailors joked softly, their humour brittle but necessary. Germans cleaned weapons and passed cigarettes with the solemnity of monks. The creak of the hulls became the rhythm of waiting, an ancient beat that drowned out thought. Above, signal lamps blinked like nervous eyes across the void, translating fear into light. Messages of bearings, range, and readiness crossed oceans faster than prayer. Every minute drawn closer meant an inch nearer to fate, and every hour felt both eternal and fleeting. Some men wrote last notes in darkness, knowing no mail would ever carry them home. Others simply stared at nothing, thinking of breakfast tables that no longer existed. The ocean allowed no sentiment. It accepted both courage and terror with equal appetite, and the night deepened heavy with unspoken farewells. By 3 a.m. the fog thinned into veils of grey, revealing glimpses of the frozen sea beneath a bruised horizon. Lookouts strained through binoculars, eyes raw from cold and sleeplessness. Ice clung to beards and gloves, and every gust of wind carried the promise of first light and first fire. Aboard Hood, the gunnery officers finalized range estimates, calibrating instruments with mathematical devotion. On Bismarck, the sound of the waves changed, shorter, sharper, echoing off distant cliffs and ice floes. The world seemed to draw its breath. The two task forces, separated by miles but bound by destiny, now drifted into the same invisible corridor of fate. The air smelled of salt and oil, of anticipation so dense it felt physical. The final night before battle was not quiet. It was listening. In the east, the first faint shimmer of dawn spread across the sea, painting the clouds with pale gold that turned quickly to iron. Through the thinning mist, shapes began to emerge, indistinct at first, then undeniable. The watchers on both sides felt their throats tighten as recognition burned through disbelief. Guns turned, elevation gears whined, and the last words of peace were spoken only in thought. The grey light revealed not merely ships, but the sum of two empires colliding on a single breath of mourning. For a heartbeat, time held perfectly still, balanced between past and oblivion. In that moment, every man, German or British, shared the same truth: the calm had ended. The sea was no longer patient. The clash was inevitable, immense and near. And as dawn rose fully over the Denmark Strait, history lifted its pen to begin a new page written in fire. The morning of May 24th dawned bleak and metallic, the North Atlantic heaving under low clouds streaked with grey light. Across the Denmark Strait, two sets of warships closed in, massive silhouettes, like ancient beasts stirring from slumber. The horizon blurred between smoke and sea, between storm and steel. On Hood, crewmen ran to their battle stations, boots echoing through passageways that trembled with the rumble of turbines below. The air reeked of oil and cordite before a single shell was fired. At 5:52 a.m., gunnery officers confirmed range 25,000 yards, closing fast. Admiral Holland's order cut through the noise, calm, final, almost ritual. Open fire. The 15-inch guns of Hood recoiled as thunder split the sea, a ripple of violence racing outward like lightning trapped beneath water. The first salvos of the Battle of the Denmark Strait had been unleashed, and the world seemed to pause to witness the sound of history beginning. Each shell tore through the grey morning with a scream that no living ear could mistake for anything but death in motion. On Bismarck, lookouts spotted the flaming arcs long before the detonations, streaks of orange cutting through mist and wind. "Feuer frei," came the reply, and seconds later, her 8 15-inch guns answered with earth-shattering defiance. The recoil shook the ship to its bones, sending vibrations through deck plates and into the marrow of the men below. Turrets swung mechanically, precise as clockwork, yet each blast felt alive, the voice of an empire roaring into the void. Water erupted around the German ships as British shells splashed just short, geysers of icy spray hammering down like artillery rain. On Prinz Eugen, cameras rolled, capturing the violence as if to prove that hell could exist at sea. Each broadside blurred vision, deafened hearing, and numbed thought. Smoke mixed with frost, coating every lung with the taste of iron and fire. And for those seconds between shots, only silence and heartbeat remained. The battle became a dance of geometry and instinct. ships maneuvering through destruction with mathematical grace. On the British side, Prince of Wales adjusted bearing, her radar-fed gunnery team struggling to correct for range and visibility. Inside her turrets, loaders slammed shells into breaches slick with condensation, their hands trembling not from fear but from vibration. Every detonation rattled the body like a physical blow, echoing in the chest cavity as much as the ears. Above deck, sparks rained from the gun muzzles, and every flash momentarily blinded men who dared to look. The sea around them boiled under impact, each explosion carving new craters of steam and foam. Hit confirmed, someone shouted. One of Hood's shells had struck Prinz Eugen, tearing open plating and igniting minor fires. For a brief, fragile instant, triumph flickered among the British ranks. Then came the German reply, heavier, faster, devastatingly accurate. The ocean itself shuddered as two worlds collided in disciplined fury. Aboard Hood, the bridge was a furnace of motion and command. The air alive with orders and replies shouted through static. Holland stood with his binoculars fixed on the distant shapes, calm even as spray lashed his coat, and flames flashed from his ship's guns. "Shift fire to the leading ship," he barked. The assumption still that the forward vessel was Bismarck, but it was Prinz Eugen taking the brunt, a mistake that cost precious minutes and deadly clarity. The gunnery crews corrected, adjusting elevation and bearing amid the thunderous rhythm of reload and recoil. Below deck, shell casings rolled like drums across the floor, and gunners wiped sweat from faces blackened by soot. The ship groaned under recoil, her decks trembling as if alive and afraid. Through the periscope mist, Bismarck's outline emerged clearer, looming like a steel cathedral of war. Holland gave the order to close range. It was a choice both courageous and fatal. At 5:59 a.m., Bismarck's fifth salvo found its mark. A shell from the German flagship penetrated Hood's weakly armored deck near the main mast, plunging deep into her magazines. The resulting explosion was biblical, a white flash that consumed the pride of the Royal Navy in less than 10 seconds. Witnesses on Prince of Wales could only stare as the great battlecruiser split in two, a pillar of flame and smoke rising thousands of feet into the sky. A roar louder than thunder drowned every voice, and then came the silence, the terrible, endless silence. Men were thrown into the freezing water, their cries swallowed by the sea almost instantly. Out of a crew of 1,418, only 3 survived. On Bismarck, even the victors fell quiet, stunned by the enormity of what they had done. The air smelled of burnt paint and salt, and in that moment, the Atlantic itself seemed to mourn. For the crew of Prince of Wales, the loss of Hood was a wound felt in the bones. Flames still danced on the horizon where the giant had vanished, her death echoing in the minds of every sailor who had ever known her name. Yet there was no time to grieve. Bismarck was still alive, still firing, still a threat. Captain Leach barked orders, maneuvering his battleship to continue the fight even as shell splinters rained across the decks. 2 heavy shells struck Prince of Wales, one tearing into her command deck, another jamming a forward turret. The concussion sent men sprawling, their ears bleeding, instruments shattered. The battle had turned chaotic, smoke, screams, and the deafening drumbeat of destruction blending into one unending note of violence. And still, somehow, the ship fought back. Each British salvo was a promise of vengeance hurled through fire and grief. Across the German fleet, elation mixed uneasily with discipline. Lütjens ordered radio silence, refusing to gloat even as his men celebrated their stunning victory. "We do not cheer the dead," one officer reminded, his voice cutting through the hum of damage reports. Engineers worked feverishly to repair minor hits, pumping out seawater and extinguishing flames. The Bismarck, though victorious, was not unscathed. A British shell had pierced her bow, rupturing a fuel tank that bled black oil into the Arctic waves. The ship left a shimmering trail behind her, marking her path like a wound that refused to close. Lütjens understood what it meant. Speed and stealth were now compromised. "The hunt is not over," he said quietly, staring into the northern fog that hid his enemies. The ocean, once their shield, was now an accomplice to their doom. The guns fell silent as both sides broke contact, their thunder replaced by the mournful hiss of wind and wave. The sea, moments before alive with fire, now seemed empty, scarred, steaming, echoing only the memory of battle. The Bismarck disappeared into mist, limping toward the Atlantic, while Prince of Wales turned away to tend her wounds. In London, news of Hood's destruction struck like a lightning bolt, shaking the empire to its core. Churchill's response was immediate and merciless: sink the Bismarck. The order carried not just strategy, but vengeance, the distilled fury of a nation in mourning. Across every ship in the Royal Navy, men heard the name and swore silently to avenge her. The calm after battle was no peace. It was the pause before a reckoning. The North Atlantic would soon erupt again, drawn by the echoes of that morning's fire, and the ghost of the Hood would haunt the waves until justice was done. The moment came at 5:59 a.m., a single heartbeat that divided history into before and after. On the Hood's bridge, men squinted through smoke and rain, unaware that death was already streaking toward them at twice the speed of sound. The shell from Bismarck's fifth salvo arced silently across the sky, its copper casing glowing red from friction as it descended. It struck near the mainmast, piercing the thin deck armor that had long been her Achilles' heel. For a second, nothing happened. Then light. A flash, so blinding and pure that it seemed the heavens themselves had opened. The ship's heart, her magazines deep below deck, detonated in an instant. A column of flame shot hundreds of feet into the air, painting the sky in crimson and gold. The roar that followed was not of battle, but of annihilation, and as it faded, the Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, ceased to exist. The blast tore her in half, lifting the massive hull out of the water before gravity reclaimed her. Men on Prince of Wales watched in disbelief, as the ship's bow rose like a wounded animal engulfed in fire. Within seconds, the explosion swallowed everything: turrets, crew, command, memory. Her aft section disintegrated, vanishing into a boiling cauldron of debris and steam. The front half lingered, twisted, before sliding beneath the surface with a hiss that carried for miles. Oil erupted onto the sea, burning in streaks across the waves like floating funeral pyres. Debris, planks, boots, lifebelts, scattered in a grotesque dance atop the foam. The smell of cordite and scorched metal hung heavy in the air, mixing with salt and smoke. On the German ship silence fell, broken only by the hiss of cooling guns. Even victory felt hollow in the face of so complete a destruction. For the men aboard Prince of Wales, disbelief hardened into horror. The horizon where Hood once stood was now a smear of black smoke and flame, the ocean boiling in her absence. "She's gone," someone shouted, voice cracking with disbelief. Captain Leach, stunned, whispered orders, automatic, mechanical, born of training rather than comprehension. His ship turned hard to avoid the wreckage, engines shuddering under the strain. Through binoculars, officers searched for survivors, finding only scattered wreckage and oil-slick waves. "God Almighty," muttered one, voice drowned by the wind. Only 3 men were later found alive, picked up hours later from the freezing sea, faces pale and blank from shock. Of 1,418 souls aboard Hood, The North Atlantic claimed all but those three, and with them, it took a century of British naval pride, vanished in less than 10 seconds. On Bismarck, men stared at the distant fireball with awe and dread. The gun crews, still at their posts, slowly realized the magnitude of what they had done. "See explodiert," someone whispered. "She's exploding." Even the disciplined steel of the Kriegsmarine trembled before the sight. Admiral Lütjen stood rigid, his face pale, knowing that this victory would summon a storm. Beside him, Captain Lindemann remained silent, hands gripping the rail, his expression more of pity than pride. "We will not celebrate," he ordered coldly. The air was heavy, the silence heavier. Somewhere deep in the ship, a man crossed himself. The Bismarck had destroyed a legend, and in doing so had sealed her own fate. Back on the British side, the first radio reports of Hood's loss sent shockwaves through the fleet. Across the Atlantic convoy routes, men stopped what they were doing to listen in disbelief. The Royal Navy, unbroken for centuries, had just lost its most famous ship, and with it, a symbol of invincibility. In London, the news reached Churchill before dawn. "The Hood, gone?" he repeated, his voice low, incredulous. For a man who measured his empire in tonnage and tradition, it was a blow that cut deeper than strategy. The war at sea was no longer just about convoys or tonnage, it had become personal. Newspapers across Britain would soon carry one line that said everything: "The mighty Hood is lost." For the first time in generations, Britannia no longer ruled these waves. At sea, the survivors clung to wreckage as waves battered them, the water cold enough to stop a heartbeat within minutes. Ted Briggs, one of the three who lived, later remembered the silence, a silence broken only by the crackle of burning oil. The sea was on fire, he recalled. He watched the last fragments of Hood disappear beneath the waves, her stern vanishing with a groan like a dying giant. Debris drifted everywhere, splintered beams, floating ropes, a sailor's cap. Around him the cries of the dying faded one by one, until there was only the wind. The survivors did not cheer, did not speak. They simply waited for rescue or for death, whichever came first. The Atlantic rolled on, indifferent, erasing the evidence of one of history's greatest tragedies. For the men of Bismarck, the aftermath was unsettling. They had won, but at what cost? No one aboard could forget the image of Hood's final explosion. It replayed behind closed eyes like a haunting. Mechanics worked silently to patch damage from earlier hits, the metallic clangs echoing like a funeral drumbeat. In the galley, laughter died before it could begin. Some wondered if God had witnessed what they had done. Others didn't dare ask. "We are being hunted now," one officer murmured, staring out across the darkening horizon, and he was right. Somewhere beyond the fog, the Royal Navy was gathering its fury. In that stillness, Bismarck's victory became a death sentence written across the waves. By evening, only an oil slick remained where the Hood had stood defiant. The sea, merciless and vast, swallowed her whole without trace or remorse. The sun set behind grey clouds, its light glinting off waves that hid 1,000 stories untold. For Britain, her loss was not just a naval defeat. It was a wound to the spirit, a shattering of pride forged over centuries of empire. Yet in grief came resolve. Churchill's message to the fleet was short and cold as steel: sink the Bismarck. Across every ship and submarine in the Atlantic, men repeated the words like a vow. The hunt had begun, a chase born not of strategy, but of vengeance. And as night fell over the Denmark Strait, the ghost of the Hood lingered on the wind, whispering for justice in the language of thunder and flame. Even as Hood vanished beneath the waves, Bismarck herself was bleeding. Beneath her armored decks, The echoes of British shells reverberated like ghostly thunder, shaking loose rivets and echoing through the steel corridors. One shell from Prince of Wales had struck below the waterline near the bow, tearing open a gash that no pump could silence. Seawater poured in, flooding fuel bunkers and mixing with oil, the stench of diesel filling the compartments. Men sloshed through waist-high water with wrenches and torches, trying to stem the flow with patchwork steel plates. In the engine room, engineers shouted over the roar of turbines as alarms wailed through the hull. The ship's heartbeat, her propulsion, remained strong, but she was bleeding energy with every mile. On the bridge, Captain Lindemann's jaw tightened as he read the damage reports. Bismarck was not crippled, but she was no longer invincible. The sea that had carried her to triumph was now beginning to betray her. Admiral Eugen stood motionless on the bridge, eyes fixed on the grey horizon. The battle was over, but the cost was clear. Bismarck had been hit 3 times and one wound was mortal in its implications. Her forward fuel tanks, critical for reaching the open Atlantic, were now leaking precious oil into the sea. A slick trailed behind her like a beacon, marking her path for any who dared to follow. Officers whispered of turning back, of seeking safety in a friendly port. But Eugen's, calm and unreadable, refused to yield. "Our mission continues," he said flatly, his words as cold as the northern wind. He knew retreat would mean disgrace in Berlin, perhaps even death in the shadow of the Führer's wrath. The crew obeyed without question, but unease settled over the decks like mist. The victory they had won now carried the weight of doom. Below decks, the damage control teams worked in near darkness. Water hissed through ruptured seams, and sparks flickered from shorted cables. The heat from the boilers clashed with the icy flood seeping in, turning the air into a choking fog of steam and oil vapor. Men coughed and cursed, their hands blackened by soot and blood. "She's holding for now," one engineer muttered, wiping grime from his face, his eyes hollow from exhaustion. They patched the holes with whatever they could find: iron plates, oak beams, even mattresses stuffed into leaks. Pumps groaned, trying to hold back the North Atlantic itself. Each minute felt like defiance against inevitability. And still the fuel gauge dropped, the clock of survival ticking ever faster. The mightiest ship in the Reich was now limping toward uncertainty. On the bridge, Lindemann and Lütjens argued quietly, their voices low but sharp. The captain, a seaman by blood and instinct, wanted to head for Norway, to repair, refuel, fight another day. But the admiral, a strategist bound by orders, saw only the mission. He reminded Lindemann of Hitler's directive: no retreat. It was not a debate, it was a death sentence disguised as duty. Around them officers pretended not to hear, their faces drawn tight as the wind howled outside. Lightning flashed across the northern sky, illuminating the streaks of oil on the waves below. The bridge creaked with every pitch of the sea, the great ship's body straining under its own damage. Somewhere deep inside, the crew could feel it, the subtle vibration of a wounded beast trying to keep its balance. The pride of Germany was bleeding, but still refusing to bow. Everywhere on board, exhaustion and anxiety replaced the adrenaline of victory. In the mess halls, sailors sat in silence, their meals untouched as the smell of oil clung to the air. Rumors spread that the British were coming, that the fuel leak would give them away, that the Atlantic would soon turn into a grave. Mechanics worked in shifts, their hands trembling from cold and fatigue. Somewhere in the lower decks, a young sailor wrote a letter to his wife, the paper stained with grease. "We've won a battle," he wrote, "but I think the war has found us. Above him the sea roared endlessly against the hull, a reminder that no armor was thick enough to withstand fate. Officers avoided eye contact, each lost in thoughts of home. Even the ship's engines, once the pride of German engineering, now sounded labored, weary. The Bismarck was powerful still, but her glory was beginning to rust. Outside, the North Atlantic had turned against her. The weather grew worse, the wind cutting across the deck like blades of glass. Waves smashed against her flanks, washing over the bow and forcing the crew to lash themselves to safety lines. The oil slick trailing behind her stretched for miles, a dark ribbon against the grey ocean. In the distance seagulls followed, their cries eerily human, circling the wounded Titan as if scenting death. The ship's wake foamed red and black under the dim light of dawn. Every drop of oil lost meant fewer miles she could travel, fewer chances to escape. On the radar screens faint echoes of pursuit flickered, British ships closing in slowly, relentlessly. In that vast emptiness, the hunters and the hunted moved closer, drawn together by vengeance and destiny. The sea, vast and merciless, had chosen its stage well. Inside the radio room, operators worked feverishly to maintain contact with Berlin. Messages flew back and forth, reports of damage, fuel loss, enemy pursuit. The Kriegsmarine Command urged caution, even suggested the possibility of rendezvous with U-boats for aid. But time and fuel were slipping away like sand through an open hand. Each transmission risked revealing their position. Each reply came too late to matter. Lucian's face hardened as he received the final order: proceed to Saint-Nazaire in occupied France for repairs. It was a desperate gamble, hundreds of miles through waters crawling with British warships. The Admiral looked down at the plotting table, the red pencil line stretching like a wound across the chart. His hand lingered over it, then closed into a fist. "Then we go south," he said quietly. "We finish what we started." As Bismarck turned toward the Atlantic, the sea swallowed the last traces of battle, but not her trail. Behind her, a shimmering line of oil stretched across the waves, glinting like spilled blood under the pale morning light. The Prinz Eugen, undamaged and swift, was ordered to continue alone, while the great battleship carried her wounds into isolation. Somewhere in the shadows, British ships stalked her scent, relentless as wolves. On deck, the crew stared at the horizon, each man knowing that the chase had truly begun. The engines throbbed beneath their feet, defiant but strained, like the heartbeat of a dying giant. Above, gulls wheeled and cried, their calls fading into the gale. The men stood silent, knowing their fate was already written in the water. For all her strength, Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted, and the sea, ever patient, was waiting. The North Atlantic had turned into a vast, merciless hunting ground. Across the rolling grey seas, British ships fanned out in desperate pursuit, their engines growling like predators in the mist. From the moment Bismarck's oil slick was spotted, the chase became a race against both time and the elements. Radio intercepts hinted at her heading south toward the occupied French coast, but the ocean was wide and the window of opportunity narrow. In London, Churchill paced before the Admiralty maps, cigar smoke curling through the air like battle fumes. "Sink the Bismarck," he growled, his voice low but burning with fury, a command that echoed across the fleet. The Prime Minister knew what was at stake: morale, revenge, and the supremacy of British sea power. Somewhere out there the pride of the Reich was wounded, bleeding but still afloat, a ghost too dangerous to live. Every ship, every aircraft carrier, and every patrol plane was ordered to join the hunt. The Royal Navy had become an armada of vengeance, surging across the cold Atlantic like a storm unleashed. Admiral Tovey, aboard HMS King George Feff, studied the situation map. A web of reports drawn across a trembling sea of paper. Somewhere within those coordinates, Bismarck lurked, crippled yet cunning, guided by a commander too disciplined to make mistakes. The enemy had gone silent, their last known position swallowed by storm and distance. Radio operators strained over static, trying to catch a fragment of German transmission. Above the bridge, the wind screamed through rigging and radar masts, rain slashing across the decks in sheets. Every sailor felt the weight of the pursuit pressing upon them, like the entire empire itself leaned on their shoulders. The sea offered no mercy, just waves that broke like gunfire and skies that never cleared. The men ate cold rations and drank bitter coffee, their eyes fixed on grey horizons. They knew they might never see their quarry, yet still they searched. The Atlantic, vast and pitiless, was now the stage for a manhunt like no other in naval history. From Scotland to Gibraltar, wireless stations pulsed with coded traffic. Enigma intercepts, faint and fragmented, were decrypted by the sleepless minds of Bletchley Park. In the quiet countryside, operators hunched over paper reels and flickering lamps, trying to divine Bismarck's path through logic and luck. Each word intercepted was a fragment of fate, each silence an abyss of uncertainty. They worked feverishly, translating, correlating, and guessing, their pencils tapping against maps of the North Atlantic. When the messages came, coordinates, weather reports, fuel orders, they carried the heartbeat of a desperate empire, intelligence linked with instinct, and the hunt narrowed by degrees. The Admiralty's command center became a nerve of human tension, each voice a thread in a web of pursuit. Somewhere between Iceland and France, the great beast fled, leaking oil and pride. The Cold War of signals and suspicion had become as dangerous as any exchange of gunfire. Far to the west, the Royal Air Force joined the chase, flying Catalina patrol planes through the gales. Their engines roared across the endless grey void, wings trembling from the strain of wind and ice. Pilots stared through rain-streaked windows, searching for the faintest trail, an oil slick, a shadow, a glint of steel on the horizon. The Atlantic below was indifferent, swallowing light and hope with equal appetite. Fuel gauges dropped as fast as morale, yet still they pressed on. In the cramped fuselage, airmen fought exhaustion and cold, their breath misting before their goggles. The sound of engines was their only constant, a rhythmic, droning heartbeat against the silence of the sea. They knew that one sighting could change everything. The RAF's eyes scoured where the Navy's guns could not reach. Somewhere beneath those clouds, destiny floated on the waves, the wounded giant of the Kriegsmarine running from its hunters. On board the Bismarck, life had become a grim endurance. The leak worsened with every swell, the scent of fuel heavy in the air. Men labored without rest to patch, pump, and seal, but the ocean's fingers reached deeper by the hour. The bow rode lower in the water now, and the ship listed slightly to port. Inside, morale wavered between stoic duty and gnawing fear. They could feel the unseen enemy closing in, not just the British, but the inevitability of the sea itself. Admiral Eugen said little, his face a mask of resolve as he watched the ship's wake diminish to a thin, oily trail. The radio stayed silent. They could no longer risk detection. Officers spoke in whispers, and the clang of tools was muffled by exhaustion. For all their discipline, even the proudest among them began to sense the weight of being hunted. Meanwhile, in the Admiralty war room, tension reached a fever pitch. Reports came in, then vanished under contradiction. False sightings, phantom echoes, misread signals. The North Atlantic seemed to play tricks on even the sharpest minds. At one point, it appeared the Bismarck had slipped away entirely. Churchill's fury burned like a flare in the fog of uncertainty. "I will not have her escape," he barked, striking his fist on the map table. "Every ship, every aircraft, every ounce of steel we have, bring her down." Across the fleet, orders flew like gunfire, and the pursuit redoubled with ferocity. From the icy fjords of Iceland to the misty approaches of France, destroyers and cruisers carved white scars across the Black Sea. The Atlantic had become the arena of obsession. The hunt had turned from strategy to vengeance. By May 26th, exhaustion gripped both sides. The British crews were running low on fuel. Many ships had been at sea for days without rest. The weather worsened again, with gale-force winds battering the decks and turning radar sweeps into static blurs. The grey sea stretched endlessly, featureless and cruel. Hope flickered, then dimmed, until a voice crackled over the radio from the Western Patrol Zone. A Catalina had sighted something vast, something black, cutting through the waves hundreds of miles from France. "I have a visual on Bismarck," the pilot transmitted, his voice trembling from excitement and disbelief. On the King George V, cheers erupted like cannon fire. Coordinates were relayed, engines roared to life, and the fleet turned sharply toward destiny. The hunt was over. The kill was about to begin. As night fell over the North Atlantic, the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Bismarck was no longer invisible. She was surrounded, marked by every compass in the British fleet. The hunters were closing in from every direction, heavy cruisers, destroyers, carriers, and battleships converging in the storm. The wounded Titan pressed on toward France, but her days of freedom were over. On her decks, sailors felt the vibration of the engines slow as exhaustion and damage claimed their toll. In London, Churchill leaned over the Admiralty table one last time, eyes glinting beneath the shadow of his hat. "They have her now," he murmured. In that moment, across the raging Atlantic, vengeance and history sailed side by side. The chase that had consumed oceans was finally reaching its end, and in the cold, relentless rhythm of the sea, the echoes of destiny began to rise. The North Atlantic swallowed sound and light with equal hunger. A thick wall of fog rolled across the waves, shrouding steel and sky in a colorless blur. Ships drifted like ghosts through the mist, their engines muffled, their radar screens blind. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Bismarck vanished, not sunk, not destroyed, but simply gone. The ocean had taken her into its cloak of secrecy, and the Royal Navy was left chasing shadows. Searchlights probed the haze, illuminating nothing but rain and foam. The wind keened through the rigging, like a lament for the unseen dead. Radios hissed and crackled with static, reports clashing and contradicting. Admiral Tovey stared at the map, his jaw tight, his orders suspended in uncertainty. The world's most powerful navy was adrift in a sea of doubt. On the King George V, tension thickened like the fog itself. Officers leaned over plotting tables, red pencils circling phantom coordinates again and again. The radar's green glow cast ghostly shadows across their faces, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. One report placed Bismarck heading south. Another swore she'd turned back north. Every guess was a gamble, every silence a threat. The ocean, vast and mocking, refused to give up its secret. "She's out there," someone whispered, but the words were swallowed by the drone of turbines. Outside, sailors peered into the mist, their hands numb from cold and fear. The deck trembled beneath them as waves pounded relentlessly against the hull. The fog carried the scent of oil and salt, a cruel reminder that death too was adrift. In London, the Admiralty buzzed with nervous energy. Teleprinters clattered, bringing in reports that vanished under layers of contradiction. Intelligence officers debated with rising voices, their coffee cold, their tempers frayed. Churchill stormed into the war room, demanding news that no one could give. "Find her," he roared, pounding the table with a fist heavy with frustration. The map of the North Atlantic, once so confident in its precision, had become a void of unanswered questions. The Prime Minister's fury was matched only by fear, the fear that Bismarck might slip away to strike again. Somewhere beyond that map, a wounded Leviathan was limping home through wind and darkness. The fog outside London seemed to mirror the uncertainty inside its war rooms. The chase had become a nightmare without a face. On Bismarck's bridge, Admiral Lütjens stood in silence as the sea hissed against her battered hull. The fog was both ally and enemy, concealing them from British eyes, yet blinding them to danger ahead. Inside the ship, the air reeked of diesel, sweat, and oil. Wounded steel groaned with every swell. Men worked wordlessly, patching leaks and checking gauges under flickering lights. The engines still roared, but with a tired rhythm, their power waning. They knew the Royal Navy was out there, unseen, relentless, angry. Lütjens gave no speeches. He simply watched the compass, his expression unreadable beneath his peaked cap. "We'll make Brest," he muttered. To no one in particular, though even he didn't fully believe it. Somewhere deep within the hull, a sailor whispered a prayer into the hum of the machinery. The fog outside pressed tighter, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. The British ships fanned out across hundreds of miles, their searchlights slicing through mist like desperate fingers. Each vessel was alone now, cut off by weather and silence. The North Atlantic had turned into a labyrinth of uncertainty, sound distorted, distance meaningless. Even sonar failed, overwhelmed by the crash of waves and the churn of propellers. The men aboard destroyers spoke little, their faces pale under the red glow of battle lamps. They ate standing up, their meals cold, their thoughts darker still. Somewhere in the fog, they imagined Bismarck's guns, waiting for them, an invisible executioner in the gloom. At night they listened to the sea, and wondered if it was listening back. The pursuit had become an act of faith, more than war. The ocean had become both battlefield and graveyard. In the skies above, the weather turned vicious. RAF patrol planes battled turbulence that threatened to tear them apart. Ice formed on the wings as the pilots strained their eyes against the endless grey void. Visibility dropped to nothing, and still they searched, flying low, hoping for a glimpse of a black hull or an oil trail. The radio operator's voice cracked through static, half lost to the storm. Below, the Atlantic stretched infinite and merciless, hiding all evidence of war beneath its rolling surface. Every minute in the air risked fuel starvation and death. Yet the crews pressed on, driven by duty, by obsession, by the thought of the hood burning beneath those same waves. In their isolation, the sky and sea became indistinguishable, both endless, both cold. The hunt was turning from pursuit to pilgrimage. Days passed with no sign. The Admiralty began to fear the unthinkable, that Bismarck had vanished forever. If she reached France, she would be repaired, reamed, reborn into legend and terror. The Royal Navy would have failed not just in strategy, but in vengeance. Somewhere on the sea, a ship commander lit a cigarette with trembling hands, staring into fog that refused to part. "She's mocking us," he muttered, and the words hung heavy in the damp air. But history rarely grants ghosts the last laugh. The sea began to shift again. Winds easing, clouds thinning, the faintest traces of oil rising to the surface. Nature itself seemed to whisper, betraying the wounded giant's trail. What had been lost was slowly being found again. The silence before the storm was breaking. As the fog began to lift, the Atlantic revealed her secret, a thin black scar of oil meandering through the waves. The signal came through the fleet, like lightning. Bismarck had been found, engines flared to life, signal lamps blinked, and orders flew faster than the wind itself. The hunters were converging once more, their vengeance reignited by the scent of prey. On the bridge of the King George V, Admiral Tovey exhaled, his eyes cold and certain. This time he said quietly, "We finish it." Across the Atlantic, Churchill received the news and fell into silence, the weight of fate pressing upon him once again. The North Atlantic had given up her ghost, and the hunt was reborn in fury. Above the endless grey sea, the storm began to clear, but in its place, destiny gathered in the form of fire and steel. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Atlantic, the horizon veiled in mist and drizzle. The engines of a solitary Catalina flying boat droned through the emptiness, its crew straining their eyes against the monotonous expanse below. For hours they had seen nothing but water, a shifting, endless canvas of slate and steel. Then, through the breaks in the cloud, the co-pilot spotted it, a dark smudge cutting across the waves, too deliberate to be nature's work. "Contact! Ship bearing 270, he shouted, voice cracking through the roar of the engines. The pilot banked sharply, and the Catalina dipped low, skimming the cloud base as binoculars locked on target. There it was, unmistakable, immense, defiant, the Bismarck. A ripple of awe and fear passed through the cabin. They were looking at the most dangerous ship afloat. The radio operator began tapping out the signal that would electrify the entire Royal Navy. The ghost of the Atlantic had returned to flesh and steel. The message reached the Admiralty like a thunderclap. Within seconds, the teleprinters screamed into life, spitting out coordinates, orders, and the one word that mattered most: found. In London's war room, Churchill leaned over the operations map, eyes glinting beneath the shadows of fatigue. "Sink the Bismarck," he murmured, almost as prayer. Across the Atlantic fleet, men who had spent days scouring grey horizons felt their blood surge again. Engines were stoked, decks cleared, ammunition checked. The fog of failure that had haunted them since Hood's death burned away in an instant. The North Atlantic, once silent and impenetrable, now throbbed with life and intent. It was no longer a hunt. It was retribution taking shape upon the waves. For the men of the Royal Navy, the chase had become personal. Aboard Bismarck, the mood was shifting too. The crew sensed they had been found long before confirmation came. The low thrum of aircraft engines echoed faintly through the fog, a sound more chilling than any storm. On the bridge, Admiral Lütjens remained stoic, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if defiance alone could alter fate. Reports came in, enemy aircraft overhead, signals intercepted. British fleets converging, the sea once their cloak had turned traitor. Below deck, sailors whispered of Hood, of vengeance, of how far the British would go to avenge her. The engineers still fought the steady loss of oil, their boots slick with the black lifeblood of the ship. "We are still unsinkable," one officer said aloud, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. The Bismarck pressed on toward France, its wake a wound across the Atlantic's surface. But somewhere above, eyes watched and wings circled. High over the Atlantic, the Catalina circled again, chased by angry bursts of flak that reached hungrily toward the clouds. The pilot banked hard, the hull shuddering under the strain, salt spray streaking the windows. The radio operator sent one final confirmation before they turned for home: position, speed, heading, every second of transmission risked their lives. But every word brought salvation to the fleet. The smell of smoke filled the cockpit as the anti-aircraft shells burst too close for comfort. "We've got her," the co-pilot whispered, voice trembling with adrenaline. Below, Bismarck's guns flashed, defiant even in her wound. The aircraft disappeared into cloud, trailing silence behind it. For the first time in days, the enemy had a name, a place, and a future written in coordinates. In that fragile moment, the balance of war shifted back toward the hunters. The order flashed across the sea. All forces converge. Destroyers, cruisers, and battleships changed course, plowing through rough waters at maximum speed. The wind tore at signal flags as wireless operators shouted over the roar of engines. Onboard mess halls fell silent. Sailors grabbed their gear, their minds fixed on vengeance. Each man knew the stakes. Hood's loss still burned like an open wound across the empire. On the King George V, Admiral Tovey's expression hardened. He knew that this would not be a clean battle, nor an easy kill. The Bismarck was wounded, but she was far from finished. "We will end it," he said to his staff, the words carrying both resolve and sorrow. The fleet thundered westward, steel cutting through storm, justice written in their wake. In the freezing rain, the sea itself seemed to sense the coming violence. The waves rose higher, whitecaps glowing faintly under the breaking dawn. Somewhere between wind and water, the ghosts of sailors seemed to whisper their approval. This was their realm, their reckoning. The Ark Royal's carrier deck roared to life, Swordfish bombers being armed and fueled in haste. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt air and cold iron. Pilots adjusted their goggles, some murmuring quiet words to photographs tucked in their jackets. "This is it," one said, his voice barely audible over the engines. The deck officer raised his arm, the signal to launch cutting through the storm's howl. The torpedo bombers lurched forward into the void. The Atlantic opened its arms once more to receive them. In Berlin, the news hit like an icy wave. Grand Admiral Raeder read the intercepted reports in grim silence. The pride of the Kriegsmarine, his masterpiece, was now the hunted rather than the hunter. Hitler's confidence began to waver, his rage spilling into shouts that echoed down marble corridors. "No ship must fall into enemy hands," he ordered, his voice shaking with both fury and fear. Somewhere in the chaos of command, the humanity of those aboard Bismarck was forgotten. They were no longer men but symbols of ambition, of defiance, of a regime's fragile ego. The German High Command could only listen as the Atlantic began to close its circle. The fog that once protected their fleet had now turned into their funeral shroud. The sea, patient and ancient, had already chosen its ending. The hunt was alive once more, a storm of steel and vengeance sweeping across the Atlantic expanse. The British fleet pressed on, their guns gleaming in dim light, their engines roaring with purpose. Swordfish planes circled above like avenging angels, their torpedoes ready to strike from the sky. On every ship, men stared into the distance, imagining the silhouette they had come to destroy. In the heart of the ocean, Bismarck steamed onward, wounded yet unbroken, unaware that fate had already drawn its final circle. The Atlantic was no longer vast, it was a trap. Radios crackled, waves crashed, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment when vengeance became destiny. For one side it would be triumph, for the other legend carved in salt and sorrow. The storm raged across the North Atlantic like a living thing. Rain lashed the decks, waves shattered against steel, and the sky seemed to howl in defiance. On board HMS Ark Royal, The deck crews fought wind and darkness to ready the ancient Swordfish torpedo bombers for launch. The aircraft, relics of another era, looked fragile against the fury of nature, their canvas wings trembling in the gale. Men in soaked flight suits worked by dim red lights, shouting orders lost to the scream of the wind. The smell of oil and salt filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, faces pale beneath goggles streaked with rain. "We'll never get off the deck in this," one muttered, gripping the stick as the aircraft swayed. But the signal came, "Launch now, or lose the chance forever." Engines coughed, propellers blurred, and the first Swordfish rolled forward into the tempest. The Atlantic swallowed them whole. Through sheets of rain, the Swordfish clawed their way into the sky, fragile silhouettes against the dying light. Visibility was almost non-existent. The ocean below was a boiling black void, the clouds above pressed down like lead. Instruments fogged, compasses spun, the crews flew by instinct and training alone. Each gust of wind threatened to rip them apart, yet still they pressed on, searching for a shadow on the sea. "If we miss her tonight," the lead pilot thought grimly, "we may never find her again." The roar of the engines became a rhythm of determination, a heartbeat echoing across miles of hostile air. At 500 feet, the planes leveled off, skimming dangerously close to the waves. The world below flickered white with lightning, and then for an instant there she was. A dark, immense silhouette, cutting through the storm, defiant and alive, Bismarck. The German battleship loomed below, her guns tracking the sky, her crew already at battle stations. The flak gunners fired blindly into the clouds, black bursts exploding around the oncoming Swordfish. The pilots weaved through the barrage, each explosion rocking their fragile aircraft. Metal fragments tore through wings, the scent of cordite and smoke filling the cockpits. "Steady!" the squadron leader shouted through his intercom, voice shaking. The sea rushed closer as they descended into their attack runs, each pilot lining up for a single shot that could change the war. From above, Bismarck's guns flamed, their sound lost in the storm's roar. One Swordfish burst into flames, vanishing into the black water below. The survivors pressed on, eyes locked on their target, hearts pounding in unison with the storm. The dance between courage and death had begun. The torpedoes fell like thunderbolts, cutting through the storm's veil and slamming into the water. Each impact sent a shudder through the air, a heartbeat of explosive power. One missed wide, another detonated too early, but one ran true. The men aboard Bismarck felt the shock wave before they heard it. The ship lurched violently to starboard, lights flickering, alarms screaming, hit on the stern. A voice shouted through the chaos. Deep below the waterline, steel bent and rivets sheared apart. The torpedo had struck near the rudder, the lifeline of maneuver. As the engineers scrambled to assess the damage, realization dawned like a curse. The ship could no longer steer. Above deck, Lütjens gripped the railing as the ship began to veer helplessly into the wind. In the control rooms, engineers fought to regain command of the wounded giant. They worked knee-deep in freezing water, their hands raw from the cold, shouting over the groan of tortured metal. Wrenches slipped, pipes burst, and the air reeked of oil and ozone. "We can patch it," one shouted. But the rudder was jammed hard to port, locked by twisted steel. Every attempt to move it failed. Above, the bridge crew realized the awful truth. Bismarck was circling, trapped in a slow, defiant spiral. Lütjens stared at the compass as the ship turned again toward the oncoming wind. "We are crippled," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The crew fell silent, the storm's roar, now the only sound that dared to speak. Far above the chaos, the surviving Swordfish turned for home, fuel running low, nerves frayed. Behind them, Bismarck burned faintly in the darkness, her wake a wound across the sea. The pilots could scarcely believe what they'd done. A relic of canvas and wood had crippled the pride of Germany. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ocean below like a battlefield of ghosts. "God, we hit her," one gunner whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of the engine. The navigator nodded silently, his face pale with exhaustion. They flew on through the night, each man haunted by the echo of explosions. The storm swallowed them once more, hiding their retreat beneath sheets of rain. Somewhere in that endless dark history had shifted by a fraction of a degree, and that fraction was enough to seal a giant's fate. Back on Ark Royal, the returning crews were greeted with stunned silence. The deck lights cut through the storm as men ran forward to guide the fragile aircraft home. Each landing was a fight for survival, the sea rising and falling like a living wall. When the last Swordfish touched down, cheers erupted, weary, disbelieving, triumphant. "We've done it," the squadron leader said simply, climbing from his cockpit, drenched and shivering. Around him, mechanics and officers gathered, eyes wide with awe. They knew the odds, they knew what they had just accomplished. The youngest pilot, barely 20, whispered, "Did we really stop her?" The officer beside him only nodded. A wooden biplane just changed the course of the war. In the darkness of the Atlantic, Bismarck drifted under the weight of her wound. The sea hissed around her hull, mocking the power that once ruled it. On the bridge, Lütjens gave quiet orders to prepare for the inevitable. "We will fight to the last shell," he said, his voice calm, unbroken. Around him, men looked out into the night, at the storm, at the endless water, at the faint hope of dawn. The ship still floated, but her destiny had turned. The hunter had become the prey. Somewhere in the shadows, a torpedo plane circled once more, its light fading into the clouds. The ocean whispered the same refrain it had whispered for centuries, that even giants fall, and soon the Atlantic would claim its greatest prize. Dawn broke cold and grey over the North Atlantic, a thin light glinting off waves streaked with foam and oil. The sea was still restless from the night's storm, its rhythm heavy, its voice low and ominous. On the crippled Bismarck, sailors stood at their stations in silence, faces pale beneath steel helmets. They knew what was coming. The sky to the west glowed faintly with the silhouettes of approaching giants. The Royal Navy's King George V and Rodney, flanked by cruisers waiting for the kill. The sound came first, a deep, distant thrum that built into a rolling growl across the waves. Some looked toward it with quiet awe. Others gripped their weapons tighter, refusing to yield to fear. Inside the ship, engineers stoked dying fires, trying to keep the turbines alive even as seawater flooded the compartments. The air was heavy with oil and smoke, the metallic taste of death thick on every breath. Above, Admiral Lütjens gave a single measured order: prepare to fight. At 8:47 a.m., the first salvo thundered across the sea. Rodney's 16-inch guns spat fire and fury at nearly 20 kilometers range. The roar of the guns rolled through the fog like the growl of some ancient god awakened from slumber. Moments later, King George V joined in, her shells whistling through the air with a sound like tearing silk. Each impact threw plumes of seawater skyward, towering fountains of white and grey erupting around Bismarck. Her gunners returned fire, their shots defiant but desperate, their rangefinders blinded by damage and spray. "Hit them for Germany," someone shouted across the deck, his voice lost in the chaos. The ship's massive turrets turned with agonizing slowness, firing one broadside after another into the storm of steel. The smell of cordite and burning fuel filled the air, choking the lungs of every man still standing. Shell after shell screamed across the ocean, their trajectories traced by the faint glow of dawn. And in that deadly ballet, the Bismarck still refused to bow. For half an hour the air itself seemed to burn. Bismarck's bridge was hit repeatedly, the armoured walls buckling under the relentless impact of British shells. Shrapnel scythed through the command deck, tearing through steel and flesh alike. Lütjen stood at his post, his uniform torn, his voice calm as he relayed his final orders. "The ship must not fall into enemy hands," he said, blood streaking his face. Below, fire crews fought to contain spreading blazes, passing buckets hand to hand through choking smoke. The corridors echoed with the hiss of steam, the crackle of flame, and the distant screams of men trapped below decks. In the gunnery towers, crews worked in near darkness, loading shells with blistered hands, their sweat turning to steam in the infernal heat. The vibration of each impact rattled teeth, loosened bolts, and shattered glass across the decks. Outside, the sea began to glow orange beneath the firestorm, as if the ocean itself were mourning what was to come. At 9:02 a.m., a shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward turrets, igniting a fireball that tore through the bow. The explosion shook the ship from stem to stern, throwing men against bulkheads and tearing open new wounds in her hull. Smoke poured skyward, mingling with the rain and mist in a single grey shroud. Yet still the guns answered, battered, slower now, but unbroken. The gunnery officer, half deaf from the bombardment, wiped soot from his eyes and shouted for another salvo. Down below, sailors worked knee-deep in water to keep the pumps alive, though they knew it was futile. The steering compartments were already lost. The ship was a fortress adrift, her fate sealed by the sea. "We'll fight as long as we float," one engineer said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the generators. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, exhaled, and went back to work. On the horizon, another flash of light, another barrage from the British line. By 9:30, Bismarck was a wreck, her main guns shattered, her bridge destroyed, her decks a graveyard of steel. The once mighty battleship now listed heavily to port, her hull bleeding fire and oil into the churning sea. British shells continued to fall, tearing through superstructure and flesh alike, reducing her to a blazing silhouette against the rain. "Ceasefire?" a young British officer asked aboard King George V. Admiral Tovey shook his head. "Not yet. She's still firing." Through binoculars they could see it, one lone turret, still spitting flame defiantly from amid the smoke. Inside that turret, a handful of survivors loaded the final shells by hand, their faces blackened, their arms trembling. Each shot was an act of rebellion against inevitability. The men of Bismarck had no illusions left, only duty, and somewhere beneath the roar, a single phrase echoed in the minds of all. "We were lions once." The German ensign still flew from the mast, tattered and scorched, but unfallen. Shellfire had shredded the flag's edges, yet it refused to yield to the wind. For the British sailors watching from afar, it became a symbol, not of the Reich, but of courage in its purest, most tragic form. On Bismarck's lower decks, sailors tended to the wounded, dragging comrades from the flames even as bulkheads groaned under pressure. The air was thick with heat and ash, with the smell of burning paint and human flesh. Some prayed, some cursed, others sang softly to drown the noise. A few stood in silent defiance, watching the ocean swallow their ship inch by inch. "Tell them we fought well," a gunner whispered to his mate, gripping his hand before the next explosion tore them apart. Above them, another shell found its mark, plunging into the heart of the ship. The sound that followed was like the breaking of the world. By 10:15, the firing slowed. The British guns fell silent one by one, their crews exhausted, their targets destroyed. What floated before them was no longer a ship. It was a burning ruin, listing deeply, her decks awash with flame. Yet still, faintly, the German flag fluttered in the wind. Aboard Dorsetshire, the order came to fire torpedoes, to end the agony swiftly. The torpedoes struck true, tearing through Bismarck's side with dull, thunderous impacts. The great ship shuddered, tilted, and began her final roll. "She's going," someone whispered. As the Atlantic closed over her decks, men leapt into the freezing water, their cries lost to wind and waves. Within minutes the ocean swallowed the pride of Germany whole, and all was quiet again. The survivors, few, broken, and half-frozen, floated amid debris and oil, watching their world sink beneath the grey horizon. British sailors leaned over the rails, throwing lines into the sea, pulling the living from the dead. The Atlantic stretched endless and indifferent around them, its cold silence echoing the cost of victory. Out there, amid oil slicks and burning wreckage, the war at sea had reached a new threshold of human endurance. The Bismarck was gone, but her legend had only just begun. Men who fought her that day would remember the sound of her guns until their dying breath. Others would remember the courage of enemies who refused surrender. Even as the world collapsed around them, she fought like a lion. One British sailor murmured as he stared into the waves. And in the fading light of May 27th, 1941, the sea closed its eyes, keeping its secret and its dead forever. The sea around the Bismarck boiled with flame and steel, the Atlantic itself seeming to rage at her destruction. Every impact reverberated through the hull like the pounding of a colossal heart, slowing with each blow. The air above the deck was thick with choking smoke, glowing ember orange beneath the flashes of distant gunfire. Men stumbled through twisted corridors, their boots splashing through blood and oil. Bulkheads groaned and ruptured under pressure, sending showers of sparks down into the dark belly of the ship. The once polished steel of the pride of Germany now peeled and blistered in the inferno. Above deck, the last working guns spat one final, defiant salvo into the storm. Below, the machinery that had once propelled her across the Atlantic wheezed and died. The vibrations that had always thrummed beneath the sailors' feet faded into stillness. In that fading tremor, the Bismarck's heartbeat began to stop. Admiral Lütjens stood motionless at his post, surrounded by ruin, his eyes fixed on the horizon that had promised glory. Smoke coiled around him like ghostly shrouds, obscuring the shattered remnants of the bridge. His voice, when it came, was steady, calm, almost gentle. "It is time," he said to no one in particular. Though all who heard understood, across the ship, word spread. Prepare to scuttle. Below decks, demolition teams moved quickly, opening seawater valves and planting charges. They worked without hesitation, their faces illuminated by flickering light and the occasional burst of flame from ruptured pipes. The order was not born of defeat, but of duty, to deny the enemy what they had fought so hard to protect. Outside, waves crashed higher against the hull, as if urging her downward toward her final rest. And in that dark water below, the Atlantic waited, patient and unfeeling. The crew fought to the end, but the sea had already claimed the ship as its own. Compartments flooded faster than pumps could manage, water rushing in with a hiss that drowned out the crackle of flames. Men climbed ladders slick with oil, their hands slipping as cold seawater chased them upward. Those still manning guns felt the deck tilt beneath their feet, the horizon shifting in slow, sickening arcs. The sound of groaning metal filled the air, deep and resonant, as though the ship herself were crying out in pain. Ammunition cooked off in bursts, lighting the deck in flashes of white and orange. Through the smoke, figures staggered toward lifeboats that no longer existed. Splintered wood and torn cables drifted where they once hung. The smell of salt and burning paint filled every breath, thick and inescapable. Above, the German ensign still fluttered stubbornly, torn to ribbons but unfallen. Even as she sank, Bismarck refused surrender. In the chaos below, men worked waist-deep in freezing water, tightening valves, cutting wires, performing their final duties. Some whispered prayers, others sang in broken voices, the old sailor's hymn, carried faintly through smoke-filled corridors. One young engineer paused to look at a photograph taped above his station, the ink already running from the damp. He smiled once, quietly, and returned to his work. A massive shudder passed through the ship as charges detonated deep within her hull. The sound was unlike any gunfire, more like a groan of release, as the great warship's skeleton gave way. Deck plates buckled, rivets popped, and 1,000 tons of steel began to twist under the crushing pressure. Water cascaded down stairwells, sweeping through compartments with unstoppable force. Flames hissed and died as the Atlantic poured in to claim its prize. The Bismarck's end had begun, not in surrender, but in ritual. The Atlantic was quiet now, save for the groaning of waves and the hiss of dying fires on the water. Oil slicks stretched across the black surface like a wounded skin, broken by the scattered wreckage of the once mighty battleship. Men clung to debris, their faces pale and hollow, eyes wide in disbelief as the cold closed around them. The air stank of fuel, salt and death, carrying the echoes of distant gunfire that had finally gone silent. Some called out for comrades, their voices faint against the endless roar of the sea. Others simply drifted, half-conscious, their uniforms heavy with freezing water. The temperature bit deep into flesh, numbing limbs within minutes, stealing breath with every gasp. Lifebelts floated uselessly beside twisted steel, splintered timbers and torn life rafts. The survivors were few, scattered across a killing field that moments ago had been a naval battlefield. In the vast emptiness, the cries faded, swallowed by the indifferent wind. Obermatt Otto Maus struggled to keep his head above water, his hands raw and slippery with oil. He remembered the explosion that threw him clear of the ship, the searing heat, and the sudden icy plunge into darkness. Now the burning wreck was gone, replaced by endless water and the faint flicker of dawn on the horizon. His body shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering in rhythm with the waves. Around him floated dozens of men, shipmates, friends, officers, all reduced to silhouettes adrift on a cold grave. He could hear them murmuring prayers, whispering names, calling out into the fog as if someone might still answer. The sea was merciless. Every wave pulled them further apart. Somewhere behind him, a voice shouted, "Rescue boats will come," but the words held no conviction. Hope was a luxury the cold did not allow. The British ships that had unleashed the storm now circled cautiously, their guns silent, their crews staring at the ruin they had wrought. HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Marie scanned the wreckage, unsure whether to approach or hold distance. The enemy was beaten, yet the scene before them stirred little triumph. Smoke still rose from the water where oil burned in slow, poisonous plumes. Sailors leaned over rails, squinting through binoculars at the small figures struggling in the surf. They knew the Atlantic was colder than mercy, and that every minute meant another lost life. Orders crackled over radios: prepare lifeboats, watch for submarines. It was a race between duty and fear, compassion and caution. The battle was over, but its ghosts lingered on the waves. From the German survivors came a mix of disbelief and resignation. Some cursed the British, others cursed fate, but most were too weak even to raise their voices. One young signalman floated on a plank, his mind replaying the image of the ship's great guns falling silent. He thought of the Bismarck's launch, of crowds cheering and flags waving in pride. All that power, all that glory, now reduced to ashes and cold steel beneath the sea. His hands ached as he clung to the wood, knuckles white, lungs rasping with every breath. Nearby, another sailor recited fragments of a hymn, his voice trembling between life and death. The sky above was grey, heavy with rain and smoke. Even the gulls dared not circle this graveyard. At 10:10 a.m., Dorsetshire lowered her boats, and the rescue began. British sailors rowed into the oil-streaked waters, pulling freezing men from the waves with numbed hands. They found some still conscious, others stiff and silent. "They're just boys," one seaman whispered, staring at the pale faces of the rescued. The Germans were too cold to speak. Their lips blue, their uniforms stiff with ice. A few mumbled Danke through cracked voices as blankets were thrown over their shoulders. Others wept silently, too numb to resist, too tired to care. Only 110 men were brought aboard before the order came to halt the rescue, a possible U-boat sighting. The remaining hundreds were left to the mercy of the Atlantic. The sea that had once carried the Bismarck's pride now carried her dead. Bodies drifted for miles, tangled in wreckage, faces turned toward the grey sky. Waves rolled over them without hesitation, claiming what was left. The water was colder now, as if mourning in silence. On board Dorsetshire, rescued men sat huddled in blankets, steam rising from their breath as they stared at nothing. One British medic described their eyes as the eyes of men who had seen the world end. Every survivor carried a ghost, a memory of comrades left behind. Oil clung to their skin, marking them forever with the battle's scar. For the living, survival felt less like victory and more like punishment. Hours passed, and the sea grew calm again, as if nothing had happened. The wreck of Bismarck lay deep below, her steel hull resting in darkness, her flag still faintly visible in the gloom. Above, the surviving sailors of both navies moved on, each ship disappearing slowly into mist. The radio crackled with after-action reports, numbers, statistics, the sterile language of war, replacing the rawness of death. Churchill received the message. Bismarck has been sunk. There was relief, but also a chill of reflection. Even in triumph, there was tragedy. The Atlantic had taken its price in full. Its waters were vast enough to drown both pride and sorrow. In the end, the survivors were carried south toward captivity, toward lands that no longer felt real. Some slept for days, haunted by the sound of the final explosions that had torn their ship apart. Others lay awake, staring into the void of memory where steel met flame. To them, the Bismarck was not just a ship. She was home, pride, and loss embodied. And though the world would remember her sinking as a triumph of Allied might, those who lived through it would remember only the cold. The Atlantic had no allies, no enemies, only victims. Each wave that lapped against the ship whispered the same truth. Empires rise, steel burns, and the sea forgets. Beneath the silence of the water, the ghosts of the Bismarck would sleep forever. When the word reached London, it travelled like a spark through a nation starved of good news. The Bismarck, Germany's greatest battleship, the sea monster that had slain the Hood, was gone. Bells rang, newspapers rushed to print, and strangers embraced in the streets beneath the drizzle of a grey May morning. For a moment, The weight of war lifted, and hope flickered again across a weary island. In pubs and factories, people cheered, raising their pints to the Royal Navy's triumph. The victory felt like justice, vengeance, and deliverance all at once. "The Hood has been avenged," one headline declared, its bold type echoing through 1,000 homes. Yet behind the celebration lay exhaustion, a quiet acknowledgement of how close disaster had come. The Atlantic was still dangerous, and the U-boats still hunted, but for that day, Britain's spirit had risen with the dawn. In the war rooms beneath Whitehall, the atmosphere was colder, more reflective. Reports came in, damage assessments, survivor counts, logistical costs. Winston Churchill read the telegram aloud, his voice heavy but firm. "The Bismarck has been sunk." Around him, officers nodded, aware of the enormity of the event. It was not just a victory, it was a message to the world. Britain still ruled the waves, but even as Churchill lit his cigar, he knew the sea demanded a terrible price for such triumphs. The loss of the Hood, with nearly all her crew, still haunted him like smoke that refused to clear. War at sea was never clean, never merciful. Even victories, he thought, come dripping with salt and blood. Far from London's jubilant streets, the mood in Kiel was one of stunned silence. The news reached Germany slowly, filtered through the language of propaganda. Softened at first, then sharpened by whispers. The Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had been lost, and with her over 2,000 men. Mothers stood in doorways, clutching telegrams that told them nothing but a single word: vermisst, missing. The sailors' barracks that once echoed with laughter now lay hollow, their bunks untouched. In shipyards, workers paused mid-strike of the hammer, the clang of metal fading into uneasy quiet. Hitler received the report in his mountain retreat, his face hardening as he read. To him, the loss was not just a military blow, it was a humiliation. The symbol of his naval dreams had sunk beneath the waves. In propaganda offices across Berlin, the spin began immediately. The Bismarck was hailed as a martyr of the Reich, a symbol of heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. Posters were drafted, songs composed, and speeches written to frame her end as glorious, not tragic. But behind the grand words, grief lingered in the eyes of those who had served aboard her sister ships. Sailors spoke quietly in the canteens, trading fragments of rumor and remembrance. "She went down fighting," one man whispered, "and that's all that matters." Yet the weight of the truth, of burning steel and silent corpses, pressed down on them all. They knew the Navy would never fully recover from such a loss. The Bismarck had promised invincibility, and her sinking proved that none existed. The ocean, once their domain, had turned traitor. Back in Britain, the radio crackled with pride as the BBC broadcast victory bulletins across the empire. From Cairo to Sydney, from Halifax to Hong Kong, the message was the same: the Royal Navy had triumphed. The myth of German naval dominance was broken. In homes dimly lit by blackout curtains, families gathered around wireless sets, listening in silence as the commentator's voice trembled with emotion. Sailors in faraway ports raised mugs of rum to fallen comrades. For them, this was more than revenge. It was reassurance that courage still held sway against fear. Yet amid the cheers, some could not forget the cost. The Hood's ghost lingered in every celebration, her men unburied, her wreck unseen beneath the waves. Victory and mourning were bound together like sea and sky, inseparable, eternal. In the German ports, the mourning turned to resolve. The Kriegsmarine swore vengeance, though deep down they knew they lacked the strength to challenge Britain again. Shipyards slowed, projects halted, and grand naval dreams quietly died. U-boats became the new weapon of choice, the wolf packs replacing battleships as Germany's fangs in the Atlantic. Yet even their captains spoke of the Bismarck with reverence, her name whispered like a prayer before setting sail. She had been more than a ship. She was pride forged in steel, and her loss a wound that would never close. Veterans gathered in dim taverns, glasses raised, to honor their fallen. She was beautiful, one man said, his voice breaking over the word, and she was doomed. Across the Reich, grief hardened into legend. At sea, the wreck lay silent, her guns cold, her hull split by fire and time. The waves washed over her resting place, indifferent to the politics and propaganda above. Fish swam through her shattered corridors, and seaweed draped her decks like funeral shrouds. The Bismarck, once a symbol of terror, now belonged to the deep. Sailors who had fought her spoke of her with respect, not hatred. Even among her enemies there was admiration for her courage and the defiance of her crew. The sea had claimed her impartially, as it did all who challenged its rule. For the Atlantic there were no sides, no victors, only stories. And in that vast indifferent ocean, the Bismarck's story would echo forever. In the years that followed, the name Bismarck would become myth, half tragedy, half warning. For Britain, she was proof that perseverance could triumph over fear. For Germany, she was a reminder of ambition's perilous price. Historians would study her design, sailors would speak her name with reverence, and filmmakers would resurrect her in smoke and color. But beneath every retelling lay the same truth, that the ocean, in its cold wisdom, spares no arrogance. The waves that swallowed the Bismarck carried away not just a ship, but an era of naval warfare. On both sides of the war, grief and pride intertwined like ropes in a sailor's knot. The sea, vast and eternal, remained the only victor, and over it all, the wind whispered the same haunting epitaph: "Remember the Bismarck." In the quiet years after the war, when the guns had long since gone silent, the story of the Bismarck's hunt refused to fade. It lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, an epic carved into the memory of the sea. Newspapers turned it into legend, chronicling the chase across the grey Atlantic with the reverence of mythmakers. For sailors, it was a tale told in bars and bunkrooms, where the clink of glasses softened the sting of remembrance. They spoke of radar screens flickering in the fog, of shells that lit the sky like lightning. The roar of the Denmark Strait became more than sound. It became history's echo. For Britain, it was a triumph steeped in vengeance, a validation of endurance at sea. For Germany, it was tragedy draped in steel and smoke. Both sides, in their own ways, made the Bismarck immortal, and in that shared reverence, the legend found its home. Propaganda had done its work during the war, but in peace the tone shifted from glory to grief. The Bismarck was no longer the enemy. She was a symbol of courage, of futility, of the human cost of ambition. Songs were written, their melodies heavy with nostalgia and loss. Ballads like Sink the Bismarck stormed the airwaves in the 1960s, turning the battle into a story for a new generation. Veterans listened with mixed feelings, their memories sharper than any lyric. Some smiled with pride, others turned away, haunted by faces that would never grow old. In German cities, small memorials appeared quietly, flowers placed by widows who never remarried. The world had moved on, yet the sea, and those who had fought upon it, never truly forgot. Beneath every retelling, one could still hear the rumble of distant guns and the hush that followed. Books soon followed, written by admirals, historians, and survivors, each trying to make sense of what had happened. The hunt for the Bismarck became a case study in courage and catastrophe, in intelligence and improvisation. Admirals dissected the tactics, debating the merits of pursuit versus prudence. Engineers analyzed the design flaws that doomed the German giant. But between the lines, human stories emerged, of gunners blinded by smoke, of radio operators clinging to hope, of sailors praying in steel corridors as their world burned around them. These memoirs bridged nations, finding respect among former enemies. The sea, after all, was the great equalizer. It swallowed men without caring for their flag. Scholars compared the hunt to the age of sail, Nelson's shadow falling over radar and diesel engines alike. And in that connection, the Bismarck became part of a lineage stretching back centuries, a final echo of an old kind of war. Museums began to collect artifacts, fragments of hull plating, uniforms, personal effects, retrieved from the depths. Each relic told a story of both grandeur and grief. The watch stopped at 10:39 a.m. A letter from a young sailor, never sent, a shell casing scorched black by battle, now resting under glass. Visitors walked slowly past these displays, their reflections merging with the relics, the past meeting the present. Children asked their grandparents what it meant, and the elders paused, searching for words. It was war, they would finally say, their eyes distant, and war never forgets. Over time, the Bismarck's legacy evolved from fear to fascination. No longer a weapon, she became a warning, a testament to the limits of power and the price of pride. In Britain, the Royal Navy kept the memory alive through ceremony and reverence. Each year, wreaths were cast into the sea where the hood had fallen. Officers saluted, the wind whipping through their uniforms, the waves rising like ghosts. For them, the battle remained a measure of duty, proof of what it meant to serve. The hood's loss and the Bismarck's destruction were two sides of the same coin, sacrifice and consequence. In naval academies, cadets studied the encounter as doctrine, learning that arrogance and underestimation were as deadly as torpedoes. The hunt for the Bismarck was more than history, it was instruction. The sea demanded respect, and punished those who forgot it. And in that lesson lay the quiet wisdom of every sailor who ever lived. Germany too remembered, but with silence rather than song. The Kriegsmarine's veterans gathered in dim halls, speaking softly of comrades lost to the Atlantic. They mourned not defeat, but the youth swallowed by a war they did not start. In Kiel, flowers still appeared at the Naval Memorial, simple, unadorned, offered by hands that remembered. The Bismarck's name, once shouted in triumph, was now spoken in whispers. She symbolized both national pride and its terrible price. In post-war Germany, where memory was heavy and guilt ran deep, the sea offered a kind of absolution. The waves washed away the politics, leaving behind only the sailors, young, frightened, and human. In her resting place beneath 3 miles of water, the Bismarck became theirs again, no longer a tool of empire, but a tomb of courage. When explorers finally rediscovered the wreck in 1989, the world watched in awe. The cameras descended into the abyss, revealing a cathedral of twisted metal and silent grace. Her guns still pointed skyward, as though defying the ocean that had claimed her. The hull was fractured, her decks torn apart, but her presence was unmistakable, vast, solemn, and strangely beautiful. For the men who had hunted her, now old and grey, it was like meeting an old adversary one last time. Some wept, others simply saluted the screen. What they saw was not an enemy, but a mirror. The Bismarck's grave was a reminder that even giants fall, and that in the sea, all are equal in death. History had come full circle, and the ghosts of the Denmark Strait finally rested, Today, the story of the Bismarck endures not merely as a chapter in naval warfare, but as a reflection of humanity itself. It speaks of ambition and fear, of glory and loss, of men driven by purpose into the jaws of fate. The ocean still whispers her name, each wave a heartbeat from that long-ago dawn. In every classroom, every documentary, her legend continues to evolve, retold by new voices, reframed for new generations. The hunt for the Bismarck remains a story of contrasts, triumph and tragedy, technology and chance, arrogance and endurance. It reminds us that the sea keeps its own history, vast and unforgiving, and in its depths, where sunlight fades to darkness, lies a ship that once carried the dreams of empires. The waves roll endlessly over her steel tomb, murmuring a single truth: the sea remembers everything. The story of the Bismarck did not end in 1941. It began anew in memory, myth, and the restless curiosity of those drawn to the sea. Her destruction was both an ending and a birth, the dawn of an enduring legend that would outlive all who had fought her. In the silence of the deep Atlantic, her wreck became a shrine to the ambition and tragedy of human endeavor. The world's fascination with her was not simply with the steel or the fire, but with what she represented, the eternal duel between creation and destruction. For historians, she stood as the pinnacle of battleship design, a fleeting moment before aircraft and submarines made giants obsolete. For sailors, she embodied the nobility and futility of courage against impossible odds. Her name echoed not only through textbooks, but through hearts that still heard the pulse of distant guns. Every retelling reshaped her. Every discovery deepened the mystery. The Bismarck had become more than a ship. She was a symbol of humanity's unending struggle with its own destiny, and in that, her story found immortality. When the wreck was discovered in 1989 by Dr. Robert Ballard, the world saw what the sea had claimed and preserved. Cameras glided over her twisted remains, revealing a vessel both ruined and majestic, lying silent beneath 3 miles of dark water. Her hull bore the scars of battle, yet her structure retained a defiant grace, as if refusing to yield entirely to time. The turret guns, enormous and solemn, pointed uselessly into the void, monuments to the power and limits of technology. Around her lay fragments of lives once lived, boots, helmets, a dinner plate, the ordinary relics of extraordinary men. The exploration stirred deep emotion, uniting former enemies in shared reverence. Survivors watched with trembling hands, some whispering prayers, others saluting the ghost of their youth. What they saw was not merely a wreck, but the frozen heartbeat of history. The sea had not erased her, it had kept her waiting for the world to remember. And when they did, they saw themselves reflected in the steel. Technologically, the Bismarck marked both a triumph and an irony, the ultimate expression of a dying age of warfare. Her guns, her armor, her engines represented the pinnacle of naval craftsmanship, yet she had barely lasted 9 days at sea before being undone by the smallest of weapons, a single torpedo that crippled her rudder. Historians would later call it the turning point in the evolution of naval combat, the moment the aircraft replaced the dreadnought. The world learned that speed, intelligence, and adaptability now outweighed raw power. Admirals who once worshipped steel began to fear it, understanding that the sea no longer favored giants. The Bismarck's fall mirrored a broader truth, that progress itself can be both creation and curse. Every innovation carries its own undoing, every empire the seed of its collapse. In her destruction, the modern age of warfare was reborn, and in her memory, future generations found lessons written in salt and blood. Yet beyond strategy and engineering, the Bismarck's legacy endures in the realm of emotion, in the deep ache of human tragedy. She was a ship crewed by men, most barely older than boys, whose courage was neither erased by ideology nor diminished by defeat. Their faces remain unseen in history's grand portraits, yet their stories are written in its margins. Survivors spoke of comrades singing softly below decks, of prayers whispered into gunmetal, of the smell of oil and sea salt mixing in the air. On both sides of the battle, men experienced the same fear, the same awe, the same realization that the sea would choose who lived and who did not. For them, the war was not about nations or leaders, but about survival in the face of indifferent nature. Their sacrifice, like the ship they served, was consumed by the ocean, but never forgotten. For even in death, they became part of something greater than themselves, the endless story of humanity against the vast unknown. For Germany, the Bismarck came to symbolize the tragic grandeur of a nation that sought greatness and met ruin. In post-war decades, her image was stripped of propaganda and reimagined as elegy. She became not a tool of Hitler's will, but a reminder of how far hubris can reach before the fall. German historians approached her story with restraint, balancing pride in technological achievement with mourning for the human cost. In film and literature, she emerged as a ghostly emblem of lost youth and wasted potential. Songs no longer glorified her power. They mourned her fate. The Bismarck became Germany's maritime requiem, the sea's final judgment on ambition unbound. In her story, Germans found reflection, repentance, and a faint redemption through remembrance. For beneath the waves, where the past lies undisturbed, she remained silent but not forgiving. For Britain, the hunt for the Bismarck stood as a defining moment, proof that resolve and resilience could overcome even the most formidable foe. It was Churchill's finest hour at sea, a tale of vengeance and vindication that matched the nation's spirit of endurance. Yet even among victors, there was sorrow. The loss of HMS Hood haunted every cheer, reminding the British that triumph always carries a price. Veterans recalled the moment of silence after the Bismarck sank, not celebration but respect. They had avenged their dead, but they had also destroyed a masterpiece of naval design and the lives of 2,000 men. That duality lingered, shaping Britain's collective memory of the war. The Royal Navy's victory was also its elegy, marking the twilight of the great battleships it had once ruled the seas with. From that moment on, power on the ocean would never look the same, and the ghosts of both ships, British and German, drifted together in the cold Atlantic depths. In culture and imagination, the Bismarck transcended the history books. Films, documentaries, and novels reanimated her, a ship caught between destiny and doom. Artists painted her under stormy skies. Filmmakers recreated her decks with reverence, and writers turned her story into modern myth. Audiences across generations were drawn to her not because she was German or British, but because she embodied the eternal drama of human aspiration and mortality. The image of the Bismarck, proud, wounded, and burning, became a metaphor for the century itself. She stood for the brilliance and madness of human ambition, the beauty of creation, and the inevitability of decay. Even in silence, her name carried a rhythm, like waves breaking over metal. The Bismarck was not just remembered, she was reborn every time someone asked what she meant. And each answer revealed more about those who remembered than about the ship herself. Today the Bismarck rests in darkness, her steel softened by the sea's embrace, her story illuminated only by memory. Above her, the Atlantic moves ceaselessly, cold and unfeeling, yet somehow sacred to divers and historians. She is an artifact to poets and dreamers. She is legend. The sea has taken her, yet preserved her. Proof that even in destruction beauty endures. Her legacy reaches beyond nations and generations, speaking to the eternal human fascination with power, pride, and fate. Every ripple over her grave carries whispers of gunfire and prayer, of courage and consequence. She lies there still, majestic in ruin, the heartbeat of an age long gone. And as long as men sail and dream of the sea, her story will live on, not as victory or defeat, but as a warning and a wonder. For in the end, the Bismarck reminds us of one truth written on the face of every ocean: nothing made by human hands escapes the judgment of the deep.